For decades, some mysteries have captivated researchers who've tried to find solutions. Now, with advances in technology, archaeology, and detective work, we may finally have some answers. Before we can embark on this treasure hunt, we must first know who the man who buried it is. William Kidd, or Captain Kidd, was an English privateer and a pirate during the 17th century. He's one of the few who've been celebrated in literature, where he's portrayed as one of the most colorful outlaws. After 1689, he was sailing as a privateer, and was later established as a sea captain and ship owner who took the helm of the Adventure Galley. In 1697, he arrived at the Comoro Islands, where he would turn to a life of piracy, with his first attack being that same year in August. In 1698, he captured one of his most incredible prizes, the 400-ton Quedag Merchant, a vessel loaded with gold, silver, and more riches. The captain was said to have amassed treasure worth £100,000, equivalent to £12 million today. This came before his arrest for piracy after his ship became unseaworthy and was run ashore in Madagascar. While on trial, he'd bartered his knowledge of where his hidden stash had been buried. Through the centuries, many have sought his buried treasure, all of which have been done in vain. In 2015, it was reported that Barry Clifford, an explorer who discovered Kidd's ship in 2000, was convinced that there was more loot at the bottom of the sea. He was right, and soon more underwater explorations of the area were carried out. A 50-kilogram block of silver was discovered on the coast of Madagascar. A joint United States and United Kingdom archaeological team led by Clifford believes that there are more of these bars in the wreck. It was reported that the silver had been found in the shallow waters off the coast of St. Marie Island. It's estimated that the discovery is worth around £17,000. The explorer explained that Kidd's treasure is the sort of thing that one would hear in legends, but people have been looking for it for 300 years. Clifford did not expect to find the treasure, and said that there was more in the wreckage. The whole cavity where he found the silver is filled with metal, but it's too murky to be able to see precisely what metals they are. The bar itself is marked with a T and S, and its origins lie in 17th century Bolivia. In addition to this unearthing of the lost treasure, in 2007, archaeologists from the University of Indiana also found Kidd's greatest prize, the Quedag Merchant, which was renamed Adventure Prize by the pirate. While some of the treasure has been discovered, it's believed that there are more caches around the world. This suggestion was inspired by the production of Palmer maps, hand-drawn treasure guides that have apparently been found in furniture belonging to the captain. These letters allude to 2 other treasures hidden in the Caribbean that Kidd intended to reclaim. This leaves only some of the mystery treasures discovered, while a supposed portion remains buried, waiting to be unearthed. In 2016, an ivory comb measuring 3.5 by 2.5 centimeters was discovered in the ruins of an ancient city known as Lachish in Israel. Teeth adorned both sides of the comb and were carved in a shallow manner. In ancient times, the artifact would be carved from wood or ivory, a very expensive material that was likely imported as a luxury item. It was only years later that this comb would be sent to a lab so that researchers could search for traces of lice. Someone at the lab noticed that there were strange, faint symbols etched into one side of the ivory carving. According to Yosef Garfinkel, an archaeologist at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, the 4,000 or so year old creation held a sentence written in the ancient Canaanite language, and it's the earliest known sentence written with the phonetic alphabet. The civilization, which lived in the eastern Mediterranean area until 2,000 years ago, had formed a writing system that would go on to serve as a basis for modern-day alphabets. There are only a few written records of the Canaanites that have survived, making the discovery of the comb even more important. It's not the discovery of the ivory piece that marks our solved mystery today, but rather the inscription that it bears. Once the 17 letters were noticed by a professor at Israel's Hebrew University, a team began to translate them. There had been a previous 10 inscriptions found in Lachish, but none of them were an entire verbal sentence. The inscription was deciphered to read, quote, May this tusk root out the lice of the hair and the beard. The sentence is thought to be a word of encouragement for people to comb their hair and beards so that they rid themselves of lice. Experts have said that this discovery has shed new light on the earliest use of the language, which was invented around 1800 BC. It was the foundation of Hebrew, Arabic, Latin, Greek, and Cyrillic. Garfinkel also explained that previous findings were only a few letters and didn't leave much room for any further research into the lives of the civilizations. There was not enough material. The comb also opens up a debate, since the inscription on the comb was found in the city's palace and temple district. Paired with this and the mention of a beard, it may indicate that wealthy men were the only ones who could read and write. The engraver was incredibly skillful as well, and was able to execute the 1 to 3 millimeter wide letters with precision, which has been taken into consideration when drawing conclusions about Canaanite literacy during the Bronze Age. Finding this complete sentence also showed that the Canaanites stood out among early civilizations. The comb's engraving indicated that ancient civilizations also struggled with something as mundane as lice, and microscopic evidence of the critters were even found on the second tooth, measuring at the very small size of 0.5 to 0.6 millimeters. The climatic conditions in the area, along with the many years that had passed, did not allow for complete preservation of the lice, but the outer membrane had been found. Experts dated the lettering to be engraved sometime around 1700 BC by comparing it to other samples found in the Sinai Desert. But this comb had been found much later than those, and carbon dating failed to determine the age of the artifact itself. Only part of the ivory comb's mystery was solved, but it was an incredibly important one. Star dunes are very common sand dunes that can be found in Africa, Asia, North America, on Mars, and Titan. The way they're formed is no enigma. Characteristically, they have 3 or more arms that are formed by various wind directions. The real mystery is that these kinds of dunes are missing from the historical geological record, which has stumped researchers for decades. They're not a new formation. In fact, the oldest star dune is estimated to have formed around 13,000 years ago. It lies in southeastern Morocco and is named Lala Lalia Star Dune. But why aren't they mentioned in historical records if they're so old? A recent discovery reveals that Lala is not actually the oldest star dune, because one found in Scotland is about 250 million years old and is preserved under layers and layers of sandstone. This is the only confirmed sand structure of this type to have been mentioned in rock records, and Geoff Duller, a professor from the Department of Geography and Earth Sciences, believes he may have the answer as to why this dune type does not appear in history. He suggested that in the case of the missing sand dune, it had been a mystery about why no one could see them in the geological record. It was thanks to new technology that we were able to uncover the secrets of the dune. Charles Bristow, a professor of sedimentology at the University College London, seconded this by saying that it's only because researchers didn't know what to look for to identify an ancient dune that's supposedly missing from history. Bristow and Duller teamed up and went to Lala to find answers, which led to these suggestions. With the use of penetrating radar and luminescence dating, they were able to determine a variety of things. For one, they found that the old star dune was formed during the Younger Dryas event. There were some stops to its growth, which would resume slowly, but in the past 900 years, the dune had added some 70 meters to its height. The arms are only 15 years old, much younger than its main body. This, along with previous findings, ultimately revealed to them the nature of other dunes and their absences. Since some of these ancient formations have turned to rock, it's believed by the two researchers that they've been misclassified as barchinoid dune formations, which look different at the surface but similar when buried. Burials of these immense formations could happen from time to time. This was one of the findings that they'd come across. It would turn out that the Lala Lalia had to dig its way out of ice during an abrupt ice age. Barchinoid dunes, specifically the transverse type, can sometimes take the form of star dunes from above when buried, which is where the misidentification may have come from throughout geological history. The team of researchers thinks that their work may help to differentiate between the different structures that the star dunes become from their remnants, which may restore their absence from the geological record. If you or someone you know lived in Florida from 1948 to 1988, then you may have heard of the giant penguin that walked the beaches at night. In 1948, a giant three-toed creature's tracks randomly began to appear on the sands of Clearwater Beach. A beachgoer found the first tracks one morning and followed them off to the dunes before they'd gone back into the surf. They measured a hefty 35 centimeters long and 28 centimeters wide. They would often appear to be emerging from the sea, taking 4 to 6 foot strides as they walked for miles before making their way back to the sea once more. It didn't take long for the sightings of the strange creatures to be reported. Students claimed to have seen the beast that they considered to be the maker of the prince, a furry-looking dog with a boar's head that would swim in the water before strolling along the beach. They exclaimed that this gigantic animal would waddle near the water before traveling off back into the ocean. At the time, the tracks would be investigated by police, but they were unable to determine what it was and said that if it was some sort of elaborate prank, it was a pretty masterful one. Another investigator came to another conclusion. He was a British biologist, Ivan Terence Sanderson, who would later wander into cryptozoology and pseudoscience. When he came to take a look at the tracks, he was able to determine that the culprit was a giant penguin measuring 15 feet tall. In his investigation, the biologist wrote, quote, "The tracks invariably followed the gentlest gradients, even at the cost of considerable meandering. And secondly, they meticulously avoided all possible snags and obstacles, even down to the smallest bushes. These are, one and all, typical animal traits." The tracks would run from Honeymoon Island to St. Pete Beach, and soon the local papers would be publishing pictures of patrolmen squatting over the large footprints, looking confused and amazed. Now, if we fast-track 40 years into the future, we'll find that there's absolutely no such thing as a 15-foot-tall penguin. At the time, the name Tony Signorini did not mean much to people. He was a worker at an automotive repair shop. It was his boss, Stephen Williams, who concocted a strange idea after seeing an image of a dinosaur footprint appear in National Geographic. Together, the two designed a pair of feet that matched that very photo, and then had them cast in iron. The feet were bolted to shoes, and Signorini was off to fool an entire community. So much so that even a biologist thought that there was a new beast in town. To get the illusion of the long stride of the penguin, the prankster would stand on one leg and swing the other back and forth to build up momentum for a lengthy leap. He kept this going until 1958, only revealing the secret another 50 years later. On the 11th of April in 1988, the St. Petersburg Times would reveal that the giant penguin that once walked the Florida beaches was nothing more than a hoax, all carried out by Signorini, who lifted 30 pounds of pure dedication. The feet were then inherited by his son, Jeff, who posed with them along with his niece, Alyssa Premru. The world is full of stories about the paranormal, possession, and presences. But what if all of those had a scientific explanation, or at least some of them? This mystery takes place across from the Coventry University on Priory Street in the United Kingdom. Across from the campus is the Tourist Information Center, which was constructed on the site of a 14th century house initially owned by a Benedictine priory. Beneath it lies a cellar that would have been open to the road, but after development it was buried. This left it only accessible through the house above. At the time that the cellar was built, Coventry was the center of the wool and cloth trade. It was made from good quality red sandstone, such good quality that it stood undamaged while more houses were built upon it over time. The final house was destroyed in 1940, and the entrance to the cellar was blocked and forgotten. This allowed sufficient time for ghostly beings to settle in, and it was rediscovered during the excavations for the establishment of the center. The cellar now makes up a usable part of this building, and sees a steady flow of visitors, both human and otherworldly it seems. The first report of a strange experience occurred in 1997, when Colin Cook, a tour guide, accompanied by a journalist, had been in the cellar. Upon crossing the threshold, Cook noticed that the man had looked ill. The journalist described it feeling as though a balloon was being pushed between his shoulder blades, and felt a strong, overwhelming presence. This wouldn't be the last time that Cook had witnessed tourists experiencing similar ordeals. A Latvian gentleman had also felt strange when entering the room sometime later. He felt a cold chill, and as though there was an undescribed presence in the room that had not taken a physical manifestation. A husband and wife had accompanied the tour guide to the cellar, as well as on a trip from the US. As soon as the wife had stepped in, she began to feel a strong presence of something that she described as barring her way. The husband and the guide had not experienced this phenomenon at all, and the woman refused to enter the cellar no matter how much encouragement she was given. Many cases began to arise, and the cellar became one known to be the house of ghostly apparitions. All of these stories would find their solutions in Vic Tandy, the lecturer at Coventry University's business school across the road, who was also a part-time ghost hunter, awarding himself the name Warwickshire's Ghostbuster. In the 80s, Tandy had been working in a laboratory where he designed medical equipment, and word began to spread that the lab was haunted. He'd experienced an incident himself as well, leading him to investigate. He discovered that a foil blade clamped in a vise was causing a vibration, creating a standing sound that bounced between the lab's walls, reaching a peak in the center of it. Tandy calculated this frequency and found it to be 19 hertz. Further investigation revealed that an extractor fan was responsible, and when it was turned off, the sound wave would cease. Later, he got word of the ghosts that haunted the 14th century cellar, and he immediately had the answer for these strange apparitions and the overwhelming senses that visitors would experience. The frequency he discovered in the lab is known as infrasound, which is below the range that people are able to hear. Tandy investigated and found that this frequency can affect people and animals in various ways. It can cause discomfort, dizziness, blurred vision, fear, panic attacks, and hyperventilation. The visitors experienced these effects to some extent, and they even saw gray specters in the corners of their eyes. Tandy found this very same frequency in the cellar, which only added evidence to the theory. Adding to this, researchers have also found that before a tiger attacks, it roars, and this roar contains a frequency of 18 hertz that researchers believe disorients and paralyzes their prey. Essentially, the 19 hertz frequency was causing tourists to see things and feel anxious and overwhelmed. The case of the Coventry Cellar ghost was solved and was accredited to a frequency that humans couldn't hear, which later became known as the fear frequency. One spring evening on the 11th of March in 1437 AD, something strange was observed in the night sky. Korean astronomers had spotted a new star that appeared above Seoul. 14 days after this, the newcomer vanished, which was only reported by the astronomers. The flare had disappeared from its position in the constellation known as Scorpius. Scientists now believe that they've figured out why a new star would suddenly disappear in the sky in a matter of 2 weeks. A supernova was ruled out because the star had dwindled far too quickly. A temporary sparkle would allow for scientists to peer into the hidden lives of stars and how they evolve. The new star was referred to as a nova, or stellar eruption. Michael Shera, a Canadian astronomer and astrophysicist curator at the American Museum of Natural History, had started looking for sources of the ancient nova over 30 years ago, when hearing about the mysterious star back in 1986. Shera believes that since it disappeared after 14 days, it may be a classical nova, which is not as intense as a long-lasting supernova or star explosion. What excited the astronomer was that the ancient sky observers had provided many details that would allow someone to figure out exactly where the star appeared. They explained that it was between the second and third stars in the sixth lunar mansion. This would position it relatively close to the horizon. The problem was that there were no good maps that told you which stairways were the second and which were the third. Shera turned to a historian of ancient Asian astronomy records, Richard Stevenson, from Durham University in England. By looking at some Chinese-derived maps, he pinpointed where he believed the star that caused the nova would be. But for decades, the team would search the area looking for the star to no avail, until he took a long break from it. After some time away from obsessively observing the sky, Shera tried again. This time, he widened the area that he was searching. In 90 minutes, he discovered it. The star was not where it was expected to be, and had moved over 580 years. According to astronomy, this star was closer, just a few hundred light years away, which made it appear to move faster. The inconvenience made it challenging to find the galactic body. A more exciting discovery was what got Schera interested in the case from the start. He believed that it could help him observe the way that certain stars had evolved through different stages of their lives. It would help to prove this theory that two binary stars were actually two distinct stages of life for the same star. He explained that stars generally transform slowly, often taking thousands of years. To observe these changes, you would have to observe the changes of a star today and compare it to the same star from hundreds to thousands of years ago. That's what the astronomer did. The nova that the astronomers back in 1437 AD had seen was caused by a binary star that consisted of a white dwarf and possibly a red dwarf. A white dwarf is a really small, dense, and no longer living star, and the red dwarf is something like the Sun, but smaller and cooler. Schera had predicted that nova-like binary stars would start to cool down and become a lot dimmer, eventually becoming a dwarf nova, which have been observed to brighten to 1/10 of the Sun's brightness every couple of months. But this had not been observed before until now. The 1437 temporary mystery star suggests clues of the stages of a white dwarf star. It was simply a nova that the team had managed to track down after all these years. But how did they know that this was the star that they were looking for? It turns out that when a classical nova occurs, it sends out a glowing shell of hydrogen gas in all directions. Eventually, the shell stops expanding, but the stars within it don't stop moving. The astronomers found that shell surrounding the temporary star in question, ultimately confirming the theory. Over the years, the Vikings have been subject to much misinformation. But one legend remains true. They were formidable warriors with great strength. Their strength and the fear they instilled were accredited to the legend that their weapons were infused with the spirits of their ancestors to make them durable, strong, and threatening in battle. On its surface, this notion may sound like fiction or a storybook. If the stories weren't falsifications, then the mystery would remain. What made them so strong? As it so happens, the story was true. The weapons were infused with their ancestors and more. According to a study, the ancient Viking smiths used the ashes of the deceased to forge the blades the warriors carried into battle. During the early Iron Age in Scandinavia, before the emergence of the Viking Age, smiths would forge bog iron, resulting in impure and soft weapons. Later, Vikings developed a ritual that would impart the strength of the ancestors into weaponry. The story was that they would use the cremations in the blades so that the spirits of the ancestors would strengthen it. And that's exactly what happened, but by no magical means. Incorporating the remains into the smithing process resulted in a rudimentary steel. This is because they were unknowingly mixing bog iron with carbon. Carbon can be found in all forms of organic matter, including human remains. By burning this form in a low oxygen area, the smiths may have produced coal made from something other than wood. In an effort to prove this theory, researchers embarked on a few experiments. They recreated the process of sword forging using the same iron bog that the ancient Vikings would have used, and added the coal from remains. They found that the carbon could penetrate the iron up to 3 millimeters deep, significantly strengthening it. Unfortunately, there are no written records of such a process occurring during the time of the Iron Age and the Viking Age, but we do know that the remains used in the forging were highly sought after. Ing Marie Danielson, an archaeologist, explained that excavations had shown that burial mounds were reopened not long after construction, sometimes just a few years after the burial. It's thought that these openings were for the retrieval of remains so that they could be used for carbonizing iron. Recent excavations led to chemical analysis revealing that the Iron Age Vikings had forged weaponry with the coal made from remains. In many cases, the remains would match those of the nearby burial mounds, confirming the suggestion. The early Viking smiths did not use this method during weapon making, and so their swords were not as strong or nearly as durable. It's likely that the later Vikings didn't know about the free electrons in carbon. Still, they did technically infuse their ancestors into them, as the legend suggests, making them strong, undefeatable warriors. Ever since the Greek philosopher Plato mentioned the legendary metal, orichalcum, its existence has remained in question. The only information on this metal comes from ancient texts, such as Greek literature. The ancient Greeks referred to Cadmus, a mythological Phoenician, who's said to have invented this mysterious metal. Plato had described Atlantis as glistening with the red light of orichalcum. He said that it had been mined on a mythical island and was used to cover the interior of Poseidon, ruler of the sea's temple. This metal was comparable to the value of gold. In a book called Journey to the Mythological Inferno, a retired physics professor explained that the Greeks had discovered a metallic alloy that had fire-like reflections, similar to that of Plato's description. The mystery was, is that fiery metal real, or was it just a work of fiction? In 2014, it appeared that the metal found in the mythological city of Atlantis had been found. Orichalcum was discovered off the coast of Sicily, where an ancient ship had sunk about 2,600 years ago. At the wreckage, divers found 39 ingots that were 300 millimeters in length. The composition of the metal itself is debated, but there is an agreement that it's very brass-like. The images of the pieces themselves don't appear as fiery as described by literature, but do have a reddish undertone that was dulled, possibly from being submerged and sanded down. More ingots were later discovered in the same area, and more testing was done. In 2021, revealing more about the composition. Through analysis, they found it to be composed of 75 to 80% copper and 15 to 20% zinc, as well as having small traces of lead, iron, and nickel. Given the gold color and the reddish tinge, as detailed by the Greek philosopher, the new discovery was henceforth referred to as the mythological orichalcum. Initial reports did not expose anything new about the existence of Atlantis. Still, some reporters connected the findings to the city, as though it was around during the Bronze Age, ignoring the fact that the story, as told by Plato, took place around 9600 BC. Titles like Atlantis Gold misled many, but there's nothing mystical about orichalcum, and it was simply the composition of other metals. According to documented history, ever since the 4th millennium BC, Cyprus had produced every copper variation known to humankind, including this purported Atlantis metal, as so described in the writings. While the metal was proven to be accurate to some, it did not appear to be anything as special or mystical as one may have hoped, since it was connected to the legends of the lost city. As for the existence of the mines that are supposedly full of this composition, well, that remains a mystery. An ancient poem called Grimnismal details an important occurrence that may seem to be mythological, a mere work of fiction. Stanza 38 finds Agnar being awarded with the wisdom of the world by Odin. Odin tells him of Svalin, meaning cooler, which refers to a shield that stands before the sun. The English interpretation, of which there are many, says, quote, "In front of the sun does Svalin stand, the shield for the shining god. Mountains and sea would be set in flames if it fell from before the sun." This makes the shield one that prevents the mountains and valleys from burning and the ocean from boiling, while protecting the earth itself from the relentless violence of the sun. This famous shield, which was said to be controlled, maintained, and owned by Odin, is mentioned in Norse mythology. It was also referred to as the cooling shield, a celestial artifact of great importance. They viewed the sun as a chariot driven by the goddess Sol. While Sol was radiant and provided light and warmth, she was also a benevolent force that possessed the capability of mass destruction if not maintained. This is where Svalin enters the story, to explain why the earth was not burning up. The initial origins and the creator of the story of Svalin remains enigmatic, but they become present in mythological texts and poems. But what could Svalin possibly be referring to? Vikings would often use metaphors to refer to things that they didn't quite understand, as many ancient civilizations had done. The line of the poem may be the first mentioned in human history of the magnetic field and ozone layer that encases and protects the Earth. This find came 1,000 years earlier, when it was discovered by modern science. In 1902, an unexpected discovery was made. It was the Sun Chariot station belonging to the Nordic Bronze Age. It consists of a bronze horse, a disc, and a gold sheet pressed into one side of it. Around the goal is a ring, almost encasing the middle part. It's said that this creation depicts the Scandinavian Bronze Age religion, which refers to the cosmic passage of the sun through light and darkness. It's possible that the surrounding ring is the Svalin shield that is referred to in literature. This celestial artifact was not a mythical story referring to a magical creation, but rather it was the Nordic way of explaining the ozone layer and how the sun is not burning and boiling the earth. Ancient sagas told by Norse mariners detailed the use of a mysterious sunstone that they used to navigate over the sea when the clouds were blocking out the sun and stars. We know that the early European sailors made use of calculations based on the sun's position to aid them in navigating the seas, but the ancient Scandinavian methods have long been a mystery. How are they able to locate the sun's position if their conditions were mostly cloudy and dark? From the time of the Vikings, Icelandic tales began to refer to an enigmatic item known as the sunstone. The fabled device was said to be an Icelandic spar or a calcite crystal, and its first appearance was in the 13th century Viking saga of St. Olaf. The ancient lores have suggested that the Vikings used these stones as compasses, yet no such items have ever been found at archaeological sites. But a recent discovery in a British shipwreck may prove the existence of these enigmatic stones. It was found among the wreckage of a warship that sank in 1592. The item was found less than 3 feet away, suggesting that it may have been kept as a navigation tool. For some time, their methods of navigation have been based on mere theories and suggestions, but a team of researchers led by Guy Ropers of the University of Rennes may have the final answer. They argue that the ancient civilization had used a transparent calcite crystal to fix the sun's actual bearing to a single degree of accuracy. It was found that this kind of stone has the capacity to filter and fracture light along different axes. Essentially, it depolarizes light. The researchers also detailed exactly how the stone may have aided in navigation. They gave the scenario that if a dot is made on top of the crystal, looking at it from the bottom, another dot would appear. This is thanks to the rhombohedral shape. Then the holder can rotate the crystal until the 2 dots have the same intensity of darkness. Once the angle is ground, the upward surface will indicate the sun's direction. Mike Harrison, a coordinator of the Alderney Maritime Trust, explained that if held in the correct position, those 2 dots would become a single image, and you would know that it's pointing east-west. Precision can be reached even under dark conditions, so the Vikings would have been able to determine direction even when the sun was hidden. Our eyes are also able to distinguish between shades, which would allow the Vikings to be able to determine exactly when the 2 dots are the same. A chemical analysis was carried out on the item found in the wreckage. It was indeed an Icelandic spar or calcite crystal. This was thought to be their mineral of choice for the directional artifact mentioned in the saga. Unfortunately, the Alderney crystal would be useless for this purpose because it's been scratched up by sand and clouded by salts. So the age-old question of how the Vikings navigated the high seas was answered, along with the mystery and the existence of an ancient crystal. The sunstone, spoken about in lore, was real, and it was used to navigate because of its refractive nature. Researchers have made replicas to prove the theory and determined that the sunstone would have been a really useful tool for the ancient seafarers. In 1992, a strange artifact was unearthed from a lake bed in Dispilio, Greece. Since then, the strange markings found on this ancient wooden tablet have been baffling researchers, and the true significance remains a mystery. In 1932, a dry winter led to water levels lowering to reveal strange objects submerged in the water. Archaeological excavations later revealed there had once been an ancient settlement built on the lakeshore, which thrived between 8,000 and 7,000 years ago. Over the decades, more information about this ancient village was uncovered. The people lived partially on the water, with wooden walkways having been uncovered, preserved in the oxygen-deprived waters. Pottery, personal ornaments, and tools were found, as well as the oldest bone flute located in Europe. But the most mysterious find was uncovered in 1992, when a wooden tablet was pulled from the lake bed. As soon as it hit oxygen, it began to deteriorate. It had survived thousands of years, but without proper conservation, it would be destroyed. That conservation has made studying the artifact much more difficult, and may be the reason why so many things about it remain a mystery. Radiocarbon dating, using the carbon-14 technique, dated the tablet to around 5200 BC, putting it late in the history of the settlement. Covering the artifact were strange markings, arranged in rows and partially curved to follow the flow of the wood. According to scholars, they don't appear to be there for aesthetic purposes, as they aren't symmetrical and don't follow any clear pattern. The shapes don't resemble humans or the sun and the moon, and aren't the typical abstract patterns that might be found in ancient art. Some have suggested that the artifact could show a form of writing. If it had only been the Dispilio Tablet with this strange text, it might be possible to believe that these were just random carvings. But other artifacts, including pottery, have been found at Dispilio, with the same style of symbols. The earliest known writing system emerged in Samaria between 4000 and 3000 BC, thousands of years after the Dispilio Tablet was carved. Cuneiform went on to evolve into other scripts, including ancient Greek that would eventually become the modern Latin alphabet. There's evidence of proto-writing before this point, where a series of symbols were used to portray a meaning of some kind. They are much older than cuneiform, and some even predate Dispilio, but it was difficult or impossible to convey a large amount of information using these symbols. Scholars have debated whether the Dispilio Tablet features a form of writing or simply proto-writing. There are some who believe that the works of Homer and other ancient Greek stories that were written almost as soon as writing was brought to Greece suggest that there had been some writing here earlier. Even if poets like Homer had been reciting the stories orally for centuries, it would have been difficult for anybody to write those stories down in such a way so soon after adopting the written language. Two things are standing in the way of solving this mystery. The first is just how delicate the artifact is. Wooden artifacts are extremely rare due to decomposition. Each study of the tablet risks damaging it so that future historians can't examine it. Another problem is the lack of a Rosetta Stone. It's extremely difficult to decipher any language without knowing anything about it. Ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs were a mystery until the Rosetta Stone, with its translations into other languages. It's possible that further excavation at Dispilio or other Greek sites could uncover something like this, but for now, the system remains a mystery. Most people today will know of the Merovingians through their links to the legend of the Holy Grail. This was the dynasty that ruled over much of the land that would one day become France and the surrounding nations, before the rise of the Carolingians. Going back this far in time, there's a lot we don't know about these historical kings, and the life and end of Dagobert II is one of the bigger mysteries. Dagobert was the son of Sigbert III, the King of Austrasia. The kingdom encompassed land that is today part of France, Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Even though Sigbert was the king, most of the power belonged to the mayors of the palace, nobles, and politicians, who would eventually become the Carolingian dynasty. Sigbert's mayor was Grimwald the Elder, who had so much power that he managed to get his own son adopted by the king. Dagobert is believed to have been an illegitimate child, so when Sigbert passed away in 656, the crown went to Grimwald's son, Childebert. Dagobert was exiled to Ireland. The politics of the time were messy. Someone took the life of Childebert, and the throne of Austrasia was briefly held by kings of Neustria, before Dagobert's relatives brought him back from exile. Dagobert was crowned in 675, but there's little information about his reign. Sources from the time say he was relatively unpopular as he taxed bishops. There was still conflict with Neustria, and his cousins trying to get the title of King of all Franks back. It's also worth noting that the mayor of the palace at the time wasn't a Carolingian, but a man named Wulfwald, who had been responsible for putting Dagobert on the throne. It meant that Dagobert likely had more political enemies than he would have had otherwise. According to tradition, Dagobert passed away on the 23rd of December, 679, but exactly what happened is a mystery. There are a few different theories about what happened to Dagobert. It's possible that he passed due to natural causes or a hunting accident, as it seems as if Dagobert was out hunting when he lost his life. But most theories suggest that someone took Dagobert out for political reasons. After Dagobert's passing, the throne of Austrasia passed back into the hands of the King of Neustria, who once again became King of all Franks. Historians have theorized that Theuderic II might have been the one to take out his cousin, as he was in line to succeed him, and this would have been easier than fighting over the crown. But the power behind the throne still lay with the mayors of the palace. It's unlikely this mystery will ever be solved, unless letters from over 1,300 years ago are uncovered, revealing the truth about the disturbing crime. Mattathias was a priest of an ancient city of Modin, located somewhere near Jerusalem. Ever since the time of Alexander the Great, Modin, like the rest of Judea, had been under the control of the Seleucid Empire, a Greek empire. Restrictions were placed on Jewish customs and practices, and during Mattathias' time, pagan rituals were carried out in the Jewish temple. According to the book of Maccabees and historian Josephus, Mattathias started a revolt against the ruling Greeks. He would pass away before he finished it. His son, Judah, earned the nickname Maccabee, meaning the hammer. Judah also lost his life during the revolt, but in 141 BC, the Maccabees won the revolt and established a semi-autonomous region. Two of Judah's brothers ruled in turn, the second being Simon Thassi. According to the book of Maccabees, Simon had a large tomb constructed for his parents and 4 brothers, with the intention of making it his own final resting place. It was built at a high point where it was possible to see the Mediterranean Sea, and so any ship sailing past could see it. Each tomb had pyramid-shaped roofs, surrounded by tall carved columns. The columns featured suits and armor, and ships which would protect the tombs. The Book of Maccabees was written several decades after the revolt, but the tombs were apparently still present at the time. Josephus wrote centuries after the construction, but repeated the same description. Other members of the Hasmonean dynasty are believed to have been laid to rest in this location, which would have become a place of religious and historical importance. But at some point, the location of not only the tomb, but the city itself became a mystery. During the 19th century, the search for this important site became a focus of archaeologists, scholars, and religious enthusiasts, who all wanted to see the magnificent structures, or at least what remained of them. But without even a starting location, it will be difficult to find anything. The village of Modin had been mentioned in the Bible, and there was very little information for scholars to go off of when determining where exactly it had existed. Over the following years, a few locations were singled out, including a cluster of ancient graves that the local people referred to as the Jewish tombs. Today, signposts indicate that these are the Maccabean graves, even though they're either Christian or pagan graves, and the people laid to rest here passed away centuries after the Maccabees. Another location was where early archaeologists noticed signs of an ancient rectangular structure. At first, it was believed that this was the famous site, but soon more archaeologists uncovered a mosaic which clearly had a Christian cross on it. For a long time, the location was dismissed, as it had to have been built after the 5th century CE. But more recent research has shown that there may be chambers buried beneath this point. It's possible that the people of the 400s recognized this as the location of the Maccabees and decided to build their own monument to celebrate them. So far, official excavation at the site hasn't taken place. Unfortunately, tomb robbers have come and taken precious artifacts that could hold clues to the truth. It's hoped that there may still be something beneath the ground that could answer this mystery. Around the world, there are many ancient and impressive megalithic structures. Some, like Stonehenge, are famous around the world and continue to attract people hoping to solve their ancient mysteries. Others are less well known, but equally as mysterious. The Cromlech of Almendres in Portugal is one of the oldest and largest megalithic structures found in Europe. It's one of the most recently discovered, having been only uncovered in the 1960s. The site lies not far from the city of Évora, but it's off the beaten path and not many tourists venture over to see this strange and mysterious monument. In the 1960s, a geologist was constructing a geological map of the country when he came across the partially buried stones. Originally, there had been over 100 stones at the Almendres site, but many had toppled over or were sunk into the soil in the thousands of years that they'd been stood there. An excavation project got underway, and today 95 stones stand roughly where they would have been when they were last moved by the ancient Neolithic people of the region. Since they were uncovered, experts have been able to uncover some intriguing details about the life of this monument, but there are still many unanswered questions. The Cromlech was constructed in 3 phases. The first was built around 6000 BC. around the time that the ancient people in the region transitioned from hunter-gatherer communities to growing food and keeping livestock. Two roughly circular rings were constructed, one inside the other. Around 1,000 years later, another pair of rings was constructed. The second set of rings sat to the west of the first and was much larger. It was also more elliptical in shape. Finally, in around 4000 BC, the stones were moved. Archaeologists believe they were shifted slightly so that they better aligned with the movements of the sun, moon, and stars. Like Stonehenge, parts of the megalithic structure line up with the rising sun during the solstice. It's also believed that the site would have been important during the equinox. With at least 2,000 years of use, it's likely that the purpose of the Cromlech changed over time. It seems likely that it was used as an astronomical calendar at some point, but that might not have been the original purpose of the standing stones. Interestingly, many of the stones have carvings on them. Some are simply abstract shapes, like waving lines or radial lines that could signify the sun or stars. Others resemble human faces and may have been carvings of some ancient deity or a form of ancestor worship. There are also carvings of shepherd's hooks, a straight line with a curved hook on the top. Because the original Cromlech was built just as agriculture and sheep herding began, it's possible that the monument was connected to that in some way. It's been suggested that the stones could have been symbolic or part of a ritual to increase the fertility of the land. This might have been the original purpose of the stones before it shifted to something more practical over time. Research into the Cromlech of the Almendres is relatively new, and with more time spent working on the monument, there's hope that some of these mysteries might be solved. In 1908, Egyptologists in Qurna, Luxor, discovered a then undisturbed burial under a rocky outcrop near the Valley of the Kings. Buried in a shallow trench were two coffins that had been laid to rest more than 3,500 years earlier. The discovery helped modern researchers to better understand a mysterious period in Egypt's history, but the identity of the woman in the coffin remains unknown. The discovery of the Qurna Queen was made several years before that of the tomb of King Tut. Like the discovery of Tut's tomb, it was the fact that the burial had been undisturbed up until this point that was the most intriguing to archaeologists. All the grave goods were still found with the coffins, including furniture, pottery, and even food. It was at that point the richest, undisturbed burial that had been discovered. Each object was photographed, both how it was found, nestled beside the coffins, and individually as they were excavated. The authorities in Egypt decided it was better that the objects not be separated, and both the mummies and the grave goods were transported to the National Museum of Scotland. The main focus of the burial was the two coffins and mummies contained within. The first was that of a woman who'd likely been in her 20s when she passed away. The Qurna Queen had been wrapped in linen, but the mummification process had been unsuccessful. She was found adorned in jewelry, including earrings, which wouldn't become popular until not long after the woman passed away. Her coffin was in the Rishi style and made from a fig and tamarisk tree. Originally, there would have been a vertical column down the center of the lid, with the woman's name at the end of the hieroglyphic inscription. Unfortunately, a second coffin was laid to rest on top of the woman's, that of a small child. The column was damaged and the woman's name is now lost. Researchers have put forward some suggestions to try to solve this mystery. The woman was buried between 1600 and 1500 BC, during the Second Intermediate Period. This was a period of upheaval in Egypt, but the woman had been buried with many luxurious items. These included many that were inspired by Nubian fashion, or had been imported from Nubia itself. At first, European researchers believed the woman was a Nubian princess, who'd been married into the royal family. Now it's understood that Nubia was more powerful in Egypt at the time, and it's possible this was just a wealthy woman who was using imports to show off that wealth and status. Some hieroglyphics that were discovered seem to indicate that she was part of the royal court, which was the reason behind her Qurna Queen nickname. A few political women have been put forward as being the Qurna Queen, based on the individuals that archaeologists know would have lived during that time period. But this is likely only a small fraction of the possible royal women who the remains could belong to. Even without her name, the Qurna Queen has helped Egyptologists to better understand the Second Intermediate Period and the relationship between Egypt and Nubia. In early 1327, the unpopular King Edward II of England was deposed by his wife and son and imprisoned in a castle. Months later, news would break that the former king had passed away. It wasn't long before rumors of his fate began to spread, and even today it's difficult to separate fact from fiction. After Edward II was deposed, his son Edward III took the throne. The real power behind the throne was Baron Roger Mortimer. Mortimer had tried to launch a revolt against the old king years earlier, only to be captured and put in the Tower of London. He escaped to France, where he joined Edward's wife Isabella, and they launched another attack against the king. They may have been in a relationship, and this second attack was successful, and Mortimer had tight control over the new young king. He had Edward II put first in Kenilworth Castle, then moved to Berkeley Castle, which was owned by the Earl of Berkeley, who was loyal to Mortimer. There were many attempts to free Edward in the following months. One of those was even successful, and Edward's minders had to recapture him again before he could cause any trouble. The official version of events is that in late September, Mortimer revealed word that there was another plot to free Edward, and sent word for that to be dealt with. On the night of September 1st, Edward II passed away. A few days later, the news would be announced in Parliament, and Edward was buried a month later. At first, it was claimed that Edward had passed away from natural causes. He was only 43 years old and had been relatively healthy, but that didn't necessarily mean that natural causes were impossible. The conditions he'd been kept in are unknown. Some sources say he was well fed and received luxurious gifts from his wife. Others say that he was kept in terrible conditions to try to force an illness into him. It wasn't until a few years later that rumors began to spread that his passing hadn't been from natural causes after all. The methods of his demise started simply, but became more gruesome and disturbing in later chronicles. It's likely that he was simply smothered, rather than some of the more disturbing theories that have become popular in the centuries after his passing. It would have been quick and left no marks on the body to reveal the truth about what happened. But years after Edward supposedly passed away, his brother, the Earl of Kent, received news that he was actually being held somewhere in Europe and decided to attempt to rescue him. He was quickly found out and tried for treason. Mortimer fell from favor soon after this and was found guilty of assuming royal power. The people who were allegedly involved in taking Edward's life were put on trial, but 2 managed to escape and 2 were let go. In 1338, Edward III met a man in Cologne who claimed to be his father. The man went by the name of William the Welshman and was accompanied by priests. He'd come from Lombardy in Italy. There was no declaration that the man was an imposter, and the entire incident seemed to go unnoticed. It's possible that the young Edward was just humoring an imposter, but others believe this might actually have been the deposed king. The theory goes that Edward II managed to escape his imprisonment with the help of a servant. As they made their escape, a porter lost his life trying to stop them. For some reason, Mortimer and his co-conspirators decided to pretend the porter was the former king and let Edward escape to the continent. Rather than trying to reclaim his throne, Edward traveled to various monasteries before eventually passing away in Italy. Starting in the 14th century, plague ravaged through most of Europe, taking the lives of a sizable portion of the population and changing the way society worked on the continent forever. But in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, the isolated country of Iceland was protected from most of the vectors of disease. That was until 1402, when the plague finally reached its shores. But scholars are still debating what happened during this mysterious period. The plague came to Iceland later than anywhere else in Europe. When the bubonic plague was first hitting Europe, shipments between Norway and Iceland continued as normal. Even though the relatively warm conditions had made living in Iceland possible, it still relied on trade with Norway and other European nations to survive. But eventually, the shipments did stop as society broke down in Norway. That protected Iceland from the disease for a while, but around 1402, a ship arrived in a port in the southwest of the country, bringing supplies and apparently a disease. Unfortunately, there aren't many contemporary accounts of what happened in Iceland during this time. The ones that do exist don't go into much detail, and translation problems can make it difficult to determine what exactly was going on. For example, in a description of the symptoms of the disease, a word is used that could describe internal pain. The different symptoms could indicate different diseases, and historians are still debating which disease exactly it was that reached Iceland at the start of the 15th century. The main problem historians have with the Icelandic plague is the lack of rats. It's well known that the plague in Europe spread on the backs of black rats, which can be found in almost every town and on every ship. The rats carried fleas, which themselves carried the bacteria for the Black Death. Even if a few rats with infected fleas were on one of the ships that arrived in Iceland, it would have been difficult for them to spread across the country. Iceland was sparsely populated at the time, so the disease wouldn't have necessarily spread as fast as in Europe, unless other vectors were at play. It was also spreading primarily during the winter, which would have made it even harder for the fleas to survive. Some scholars have theorized that it wasn't actually the bubonic plague that hit Iceland, but a pneumonic form of the disease. It might have even been a mixture of diseases, with typhus fever and anthrax also playing a role. Without more details about the symptoms, it's impossible for scholars to know precisely what happened. Another problem that experts have when looking back at this historical mystery is the difficulties in figuring out just how many people passed away. Some estimates claim that 50% of the population passed. There are disturbing accounts of entire families being wiped out by the disease, or somewhere only 1 or 2 from a family of 9 survive. But the highest estimate might not be entirely accurate. It's possible that there could have been a general depopulation during this period, as people moved off farms or sought an easier life somewhere else. It might also have been harder to get an accurate population count due to just how rural Iceland was at the time. After a few years, the plague naturally faded away. It was little more than a memory when in the 1490s it suddenly struck again. There are even fewer sources about this period, making it even more mysterious. The disease faded away again after just a few years, potentially leaving Iceland's population devastated, or possibly having less impact on the island nation than it did in the rest of Europe. Only extensive research into the topic will uncover the answer. After centuries of exploration by Egyptologists, it can seem like there isn't much left to discover about ancient Egypt. But somewhere beneath the desert, or within the walls of the valleys, there are many undiscovered tombs which may hold explanations for mysteries left unsolved. One of these mysteries is the location of the tomb of High Priest Herihor. Herihor never took the title of king or pharaoh, though he did wield the power of one. During the reign of Ramses XI, the last king of the New Kingdom, Herihor may have been the power behind the throne, and he had complete control over southern Egypt. Unfortunately, there are many details about Herihor's life that remain unknown. He was part of the priesthood of Amun, which had a lot of power by the time of the Late Kingdom. They owned 2/3 of all the temple land, as well as 90% of the ships and 80% of the factories. Herihor was also a military commander, and when the pharaoh tried to suppress one high priest of Amun, Herihor rose in his place. He had military and economic power and may have been the pharaoh's brother-in-law. Whatever his reason, Ramses made Herihor the new high priest, and apparently had the ability to rein him in. Herihor never called himself a king, but he had the wealth and power of one, especially in Upper Egypt. It's been speculated that if he'd outlived Ramses, he may have gone on to establish his own dynasty, and the third intermediate period could have been postponed. As it was, Herihor passed away before he could assume total control. Like many factors about his life, it's something of a mystery when he actually passed, but experts estimate it would have been around 1074 BC, roughly 5 years before the passing of Ramses. It's also believed that he passed before his wife. Between 1860 and 1881, a cache of mummies was discovered near the modern city of Luxor. It was referred to as the Royal Cache, and over 50 mummies were discovered hidden away in the tombs. They ranged in age from the 18th to the 21st dynasty, the one that Ramses XI had been a part of. As historians tried to unravel the mystery of the tomb, they realized that it had been filled during the reign of Herihor. Tomb robberies had been a problem in ancient Egypt since the first burials, and Herihor was working to renew the graves of many old pharaohs. They were reinterred in the royal cache, where they would be kept safe. Archaeologists have reason to believe that Herihor's tomb had somehow gone unnoticed by grave robbers to this day. It's believed to be another sealed tomb like that of King Tut, but filled with even more riches than that of the boy king. None of his grave goods, other than the joint funerary papyrus, have ever been identified, suggesting they didn't somehow end up on the black market or mixed up with other ancient grave goods. The discovery of Herihir's tomb would solve one of the biggest unsolved mysteries of the late New Kingdom period, and may offer a fascinating insight into who this powerful figure actually was. In 1807, 2 new residents arrived in Hildburghausen and lived extremely secretive lives. The locals referred to them as the Dark Counts, adding to the mystery of these strange individuals. 200 years later, the identity of the Dark Countess is still a strange unsolved mystery. Residents described the Dark Countess as being around 18 years old when she arrived in Hildburghausen, and it would have been hard for them to know for certain. She was rarely seen outside her home, and then only in a carriage or with a veil covering her face. Her companion, the Count, was a little more talkative, but he also didn't reveal much about the mysterious woman. The Count claimed that they were not married or lovers, but he performed a more caretaker role. Despite living in a German state, he only spoke French to the woman and called her Your Grace. They lived a comfortable life, with the Count spending what would today be millions of euros on keeping the castle staffed and maintained. The staff there were relatively well paid for the time, and there doesn't appear to be any stories of anybody being mistreated there. Even though there didn't seem to be any money problems, there was evidence on at least one occasion that the Duke stepped in and told the local authorities to treat the Count courteously about rent. The Counts obviously had friends in high places, though none seemed to come visit them at the castle itself. In 1837, the Countess passed away. After this, the Count revealed a little more about himself and about the woman that he'd been taking care of for the past 30 years. He claimed that her name was Sophia Bada, and she was 58 years old at the time of her passing. That would have made her roughly 10 years older than the locals had guessed. That was all the information they would get about the Countess, and most believe the name was a pseudonym. The Count was actually Leonardus Cornelius van der Valk, and we do have more information about him. Van der Valk was a Dutch diplomat who'd been a secretary in Paris at one point. He also served in the French army and was known to hang out with aristocrats. That didn't necessarily explain why Van der Valk seemed to be friends with the Duke, or who the mysterious Sophia Bada was. It seemed strange to believe that the Duke was offering assistance to a random diplomat and his friend. Rumors began to spread that the Countess was actually Marie Therese, the daughter of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. In 2013, the remains of the Dark Countess were exhumed, and DNA testing proved that this was not the case. And so the mystery of her identity continues. Titus Livius, better known as Livy, was one of the most important Roman historians. He wrote over 100 books about the history of Rome, from its mythological founding all the way up until the time that he was living in. Despite their importance, only 35 complete books remain today, and the rest are lost to history. Livy was unusual for a historian. It was his full-time occupation, but he didn't have a benefactor. It meant that his history of Rome was more unbiased than other works from the period. It wasn't completely without bias, though. Livy believed Rome was in a moral decline, and wrote about the past in a way to reflect that. Even with this, the documents we have today are useful for historians looking back on the ancient past. There were other flaws in Livy's writing. He wasn't a politician, and he didn't have a military background. That meant that he didn't have access to a lot of the documents that some of his peers had, and didn't have the working knowledge of military or government procedures. He made small mistakes in this, but his audience didn't mind. His work was readable, and unlike more boring accounts of Roman history, the books were instantly popular with both the general public and the Roman elite. Augustus in particular seemed to be fond of Livy. The books were copied many times and spread around Roman lands. In ancient times, the writing would have to be copied by hand, often in places like monasteries. Monasteries would keep master copies, which would then be copied upon the request of a buyer. Even though Livy's history was immensely popular, it was long. In later centuries, people preferred to just read summaries of the books. Soon enough, it was these summaries that were being copied and shared rather than the longer books. It wasn't until the Renaissance that historians realized this mistake they'd made. Old parchment and scrolls disintegrate over time, and with no new copies of the original works being made, there was a risk that Livy's history could be lost forever. By this point, many of the old works had already started to disappear. Today, 35 books exist in full. The first 10 books and preface were saved. These cover events until 293 BC. Books 21 through 45 were also saved, which cover events from 219 to 166 BC. Fragments of other books survive, but for the most part, all we have are summaries and quotes from other writers. In 1924, there was a flurry of excitement when a scholar claimed to have found the 107 lost books in the cellar of an ancient monastery. He claimed that during an invasion of Sicily in southern Italy, monks in those areas transported their manuscripts to Naples, where they were copied and shared. The manuscripts were then hidden and bricked up in a cellar, where they remained for centuries until the scholar rediscovered them. Unfortunately, though, it turned out to be a hoax. There is still hope that someday something like this might happen. If the manuscripts were kept in the right conditions, they may have survived the centuries, and the details of Livy's lost histories could be revealed. In the 1950s, archaeologists at the ancient site of Jericho made an unusual discovery: the remains of an ancient tower, constructed against a wall that may once have surrounded the city. Ever since, researchers have been puzzled about the exact purpose of this strange structure. Jericho has been described as the oldest city in the world, though when it was first settled, it was little more than a village. When archaeologists first uncovered the city walls, they guessed that these were the structures referred to in the Bible, and dated them to the Bronze Age. But further research uncovered that they were actually much older, and dated back to the Neolithic period, about 10,000 years ago. But it should be noted that archaeologists seem to be dead set on proving biblical history to be incorrect, even when certain pieces of evidence directly prove otherwise. So the actual age is still highly debatable. Regardless, the walls were constructed before the people who made them had even begun to create pottery. This was the time period when hunter-gatherer societies were first beginning to settle down in the region. Agriculture hadn't started yet, but it would soon bloom in the area and make Jericho a small but powerful city. The reasons why these ancient people decided to settle in Jericho specifically are clear, due to the number of water sources and the terrain being relatively easy to defend against. But the reason for the settlement in the first place is less clear. The period is surrounded by mystery. This was long before written text, so much of what happened during this period is a mystery to modern historians. But the existence of the tower may be a clue as to the mindsets of these ancient people. The tower was a conical shape. It rose roughly 8 meters in height, 4 meters above the wall that was constructed against it. At its base, it was 9 meters in diameter, but tapered to roughly 7 meters at the top. Inside the tower was a steep staircase, with 22 steps cut from limestone. It would have taken 100 people over 100 days to construct, and was a monumental effort for the people that made it. At first, historians theorized that the walls and the tower may have been for defensive purposes. Many of the oldest stories about Jericho feature the city coming under attack and being protected by the walls that surrounded it. But there's no archaeological evidence of any human threats to the settlement at the time that the walls and the tower were built. Another possibility is that it was some kind of flood defense. The settlement had good access to rivers, which made it a valuable place to settle. But being in close proximity to rivers meant that flooding would always be a concern. But there was again no evidence of significant flooding during this period. A study published in 2011 offered another possible solution to this strange historical mystery. By using a computer model to look at ancient sunrises and sunsets in the region at that time, researchers discovered that the central staircase inside the tower perfectly lined up with the direction of shadows cast from the nearby mountains at sunset on the summer solstice. At sunset, on the longest day of the year, the shadows cast by the nearby mountains would first hit the tower, and then engulf the rest of the city. The researchers proposed that this astronomical factor was not just a coincidence. The tower had been built by some kind of symbolic connection to the mountains, and possibly as a protection against the darkness itself. Many archaeological discoveries can help historians and researchers to answer mysteries we have about the ancient past. But until the pieces of the puzzle are put together, they can be quite mysterious themselves. The Noah skeleton is a name used for many different archaeological discoveries. One of those is the remains of a middle-aged man who passed away 6,500 years ago. The discovery was originally made between 1929 and 1930 during a dig at the ancient site of Ur. Ur was a Sumerian city-state that became a powerful center in the Mesopotamian region. It's possibly best known today for the ziggurat, a massive construction that formed part of a palace complex during the Bronze Age. But the settlement of Ur dates back much earlier than the ziggurat. It was around the palace complex that a joint archaeological dig between the British and Penn museums took place in the 1920s and 30s, led by Sir Leonard Woolley. The excavations focused mostly on the time period when the ziggurat was in use, but one particular dig uncovered something much more ancient. Buried 50 feet below the Royal Cemetery, archaeologists found a layer of water-lain silt. Within that layer were the remains of 48 people from the Ubaid period, between 5500 and 400 BC, around the time when Ur was first settled. The silt layer was particularly fascinating for archaeologists. It was described as a flood layer. Researchers believe that Ur was once an island that sat in a marshy area. The silt layer had been deposited on the settlement during what would have been a catastrophic flood event. The people rebuilt Ur, and it continued to grow in strength until the story of the flood was nothing more than a legend. Flood stories are common in ancient and even modern mythology. The Epic of Gilgamesh features such a story, as does the Bible, but cultures in China and America also had similar flood stories. Historians are still debating whether these originated from a singular worldwide event, such as rising sea levels, or multiple local events. If the latter is the case, the flood that took place in Ur may have been the one to inspire the Gilgamesh story. For the people who'd been buried at Ur, this was far more than a story. It would have been a very recent memory. Archaeologists were able to determine that those 48 individuals had managed to survive the flood, as their graves had been dug into the silt layer, but they would likely have been alive during it. Research into the remains could provide valuable insight into what life was like at the time. When the remains were discovered, only one skeleton was in good enough condition to be removed. Archaeologists covered it and the surrounding soil in wax, then covered it in plaster of Paris to protect it during the journey. It was moved to the Penn Museum in Philadelphia, but activists at the time didn't realize how significant the find was, and the remains were placed in storage. It was only after a digitization project that the museum staff realized what the skeleton represented. The skeleton is that of a man who was roughly 50 years old when he passed away. He was given the nickname Noah by researchers, which attracted a lot of attention from the media. But details of who he actually was will only come when more analysis has been done. Noah was with pottery shards, which may help archaeologists determine more information about who he was. Analysis of the remains themselves could also provide information about Noah's diet, lifestyle, and how he passed away. It may even be possible to extract DNA, which could provide more insight into this mysterious time. In the mid-19th century, gravediggers at a church in Glasgow uncovered a strange artifact. It was the beginning of a series of discoveries which revealed some insights into a mysterious period of Scottish history. The artifact uncovered in 1855 was a large sarcophagus, carved out of sandstone and buried in the graveyard of a church in Govan, a district in Glasgow. It was filled with dirt, and there were no remains inside, but it was clearly something special. Around the same time, a collection of other large stones that seemed to be from the same time period were also uncovered. They were brought into the church. When space ran out inside the church, 14 of the stones were placed at the eastern edge of the graveyard. The sarcophagus was in a good condition. It was dated to around the 9th century, but it clearly hadn't been outside for that entire time. Researchers realized that it had actually been held inside the church for most of that time, and had only been removed outside during the dissolution of the monasteries. Who, if anybody, had been entombed within the sarcophagus is still a mystery, but experts have some ideas. King Constantine I was a Pictish king who ruled between 862 and 877. He fought off Viking invasions in the area, but lost his life in one such invasion. Afterwards, he was venerated as a saint by some, and became the patron saint of the kingdom of Strathclyde, which rose in power after Constantine's passing. The kingdom of Strathclyde itself is extremely mysterious. The people left behind no written documents. We do know that the center of power was Govan, and that the sarcophagus and the rest of the Govan stones would have been created early in this period. It's possible that the sarcophagus was used to house Constantine's remains, or relics belonging to him. It would have made the church even more significant, but as no remains were found, and no record has been kept, it's impossible to say for certain. The sarcophagus could easily have belonged to another ruler. Constantine's role as someone who fought against invasion makes the presence of some of the other Govan stones more mysterious. 5 of the Govan stones are hogbacks. At first glance, they look like the backs of hogs or similar animals, which earned them the strange name, but they were actually used as markers for Norse graves. The Govan stones are the largest collection of hogbacks in Scotland, and the stones themselves are some of the largest found in Britain. The shape is actually supposed to resemble a Viking hall. Close inspection of the stones will reveal graves that resemble roof tiles, and animals are depicted at either end, possibly as a symbol of protection. Researchers aren't certain whether the hogbacks are supposed to depict the halls of a chieftain or a powerful Viking ruler, or possibly halls from the afterlife. An interesting factor about the hogbacks is that they're typically only found in areas where the Viking settlers are not in control. They aren't found in the Viking homelands or in places like Ireland, where they dominated the local population. They may have been a kind of calling card, or the burials in an early Christian church may have been an attempt to win approval within the local population. Work is still ongoing to understand this period of history, and the stones will no doubt play a role in helping historians unravel the mystery. New stones are still being uncovered, with one being rediscovered as recently as 2023. Each new discovery is a new chance to unlock a piece of this strange puzzle. In 2011, archaeologists from Cambridge University began a dig at a field in the nearby Trumpington Meadows, which was set for redevelopment. They expected to find artifacts from the Beaker period and the Iron Age, but it was believed that this area had been used for agriculture since the Anglo-Saxon times. It was a shock, then, to find not only burials from the Anglo-Saxon period, but an extremely rare example of a bed burial from an early Christian grave. 4 or 5 graves from the late 7th century were discovered near a Beaker burial mound. They were arranged in a line, with their heads facing west-northwest. The soil conditions meant that the bones had been badly preserved, but partial remains of 4 skeletons were recovered. The most intriguing of these was that of a young woman. She'd been buried at the end of the line of graves. At first, it was believed that she was the first to be entered, but later analysis revealed that she was actually the last. Shortly after she'd been buried there, the hamlet where she'd once lived had been abandoned, and the field returned for agricultural use. But the state of her grave seems to indicate that she wasn't someone who would have been easily forgotten. The woman had been buried, lying on top of a small bed. Most of the wood has disintegrated in the centuries since it was buried, but what remains shows something that was intricately carved. It would have been of high quality, as there were other grave goods she was buried with. They included glass beads, a comb, and a gold and garnet pectoral cross. The cross lay on her chest and would have been sewn into the clothes she was buried in. It was of high quality and displayed not just the wealth the woman once held, but also an unusual religious factor. The woman had passed away not long after the Pope had sent St. Augustine to England to spread the religion. At the time, the elites had converted the pagan beliefs to Christianity, and the young woman may have been one of the first Christian converts in the region. Even then, the pectoral cross was extremely rare. Only a handful have ever been discovered from the time period. Most were discovered in the graves of other young women, but the most famous comes from the grave of St. Cuthbert. Historians were intrigued by this young woman and the mysteries that her grave showed. She was someone important. She would have been part of the nobility, if not royalty, but there was no record of this gravesite, let alone who this individual was in life. While the skeleton as a whole wasn't in the best condition, the teeth surprisingly were. By analyzing isotopes from the woman's teeth, researchers were able to learn a lot about her, which only led to more questions about this strange mystery. It was discovered that the woman had been born somewhere near the Alps. She was likely from a region of southern Germany, another place where bed burials have been found. She moved to England sometime after she turned 7 and suffered from ill health for a long period of time. She passed away while still young. It's been speculated that the woman might have traveled to England as part of an effort to convert pagans, but if this is the case, there's no record of these events, and her presence in this particular part of England is unexplained. Some of the most intriguing historical mysteries concern ancient languages that are no longer spoken today. There are countless languages from around the world that have gone extinct. Many have close relatives that survive, while others have some kind of written form that historians can use to piece together what the ancient language sounded like. But there are some that are almost impossible to reconstruct. The language of the Picts in Scotland is one such language. The Pictish people themselves are relatively mysterious. The people lived beyond the reach of the Roman Empire and outside their sphere of influence. It's not even known what they called themselves. The name for Picts might simply be what Romans referred to them as, and comes from the Latin word for painted ones. What little we know about them primarily comes from outsiders who naturally weren't completely fond of their neighbors who they had little in common with. The Picts themselves didn't leave behind much of a written record. The writing we do have primarily consists of what may be gravestones or boundary markers. Whether or not this is actual writing is still debated by scholars. The symbols more closely resemble pictures, and it could be a form of proto-writing or hieroglyphs. The meanings of the symbols are lost, but it seems they most likely refer to names, especially if they're grave markers of some kind. Even if it was possible to determine this is actually a form of writing, it doesn't help us to decipher the Pictish language. The amount of writing we have is extremely limited, so we have very little to extrapolate from, and that would only be of limited help in determining what the words actually say. Historians had copious amounts of Egyptian hieroglyphs, but it wasn't until the discovery of the Rosetta Stone that they were able to determine what any of it meant. Historians would likely need a Scottish Rosetta Stone to figure out any Pictish writing. Another element to this mystery is that we simply don't know what kind of language Pictish was. For much of the 20th century, it was believed that Pictish could have been a non-Indo-European language isolate. There are a few languages still spoken in Europe today that fall into this category. Most of these are part of the Uralic family tree, but some, like Basque, are unrelated to any other known language. Some suspect that Pictish may somehow be related to Basque and point to similarities between Pictish names and words found in this language. But there are plenty of similarities between the fragments of Pictish we know and the Celtic languages, which would have been spoken in the areas surrounding the Pict people. It seems likely that some kind of Celtic language or languages were spoken in the Pictland at some point while the Pictish people were still the dominant force in the region. It may not necessarily have been the only language, but the Picts weren't completely isolated from their neighbors, and having a common language would have helped with things like trade and land disputes. Eventually, if Pictish was its own separate language, it was replaced by Celtic. The only fragments of it that survive today come from place names, especially those that start with the phrase Pits, which is believed to have been something like piece of land, and the names of old kings. The lack of information hasn't stopped historians from trying to piece together clues in this historical mystery, but it seems unlikely that this will ever be solved. Not all historical mysteries concern human history. In some instances, the history of the natural world can be just as mysterious. In 1936, the last known example of the thylacine, or the Tasmanian tiger, passed away at a zoo in Hobart. But the mysterious creature continues to fascinate the public and scientists alike. At first glance, some might mistake the Tasmanian tiger as a species of canine. It does resemble a long dog with an oddly stiff tail. The name conjures up images of some kind of feline species, but the animal is actually not closely related to either of these. The thylacine was actually a marsupial, like the kangaroo, and the largest Australian apex predator to survive in modern times. It lived primarily on the island of Tasmania, but there had been sightings of the animal on Australian mainland. But it didn't survive long once European colonists arrived in the country. As an apex predator, the animal filled the same niche that wolves or similar animals might fill in Europe. That was why the thylacine evolved to have similar facial features and body types to those animals. And Europeans had the same problems with thylacines as they did with wolves. They would prey on sheep and similar livestock, and so they were hunted. The local government offered bounties for thylacine remains in an effort to eradicate them. It was successful. In 1906, 58 bounties were paid out, but in the following years, fewer and fewer thylacines were captured. This wasn't a case of the animal adapting to live alongside humans. They were simply lower in number. The last thylacine to be found in the wild was discovered in 1930. It had already been attacked by a farmer and was no longer alive when they realized what it was. When authorities realized that the species was nearing extinction, there were some efforts to preserve it in whatever way they could. Normally, this was simply the preservation of remains, but some thylacines were kept in zoos. Hobart, the capital of Tasmania, had one thylacine. It was accidentally locked out of its shelter on a cold night and passed away due to exposure in 1936. It wasn't until the zoo tried to locate a replacement that they realized there wasn't one to be found. But almost as soon as it was announced that the Tasmanian tiger was extinct, people reported spotting the animal out in the wild. Those reports have continued ever since. There have been numerous expeditions by charities and local governments to try to prove once and for all whether the Tasmanian tiger is actually extinct. Enthusiasts have shared photos, videos, and physical remains as proof of their continued existence, but most of these have been dismissed as being other animals. But it may be possible that this mysterious animal actually exists today. There's plenty of wilderness in Tasmania that very few people have explored. There are many people in history whose stories are now more legendary than historical. We know these people existed, and they probably did important things that had a lasting impact on the society they lived in. But their actual story is far more mysterious and unknown today than the stories that are actually told. In Scotland, this goes for the historical figure Kenneth MacAlpin, who's sometimes called the first king of the Scots. Kenneth was born sometime between 800 and 810 CE in the kingdom of Dalriada, on Scotland's west coast. At the time, there were four major powers in Scotland. Along with Dalriada were the Picts in the north, the Britons to Dalriada's south, and the Kingdom of Northumbria to the southeast. The four kingdoms regularly attacked one another, and were all attacked by Viking raiders. Kenneth was the son of Alpin, but who exactly this man was is something of a mystery for historians. The official narrative is that Alpin was the king of Dalriada, and he lost his life while battling the Picts sometime around 838. But there's no actual record of Alpin as anybody other than Kenneth's father, and he was likely more of a minor noble figure. But through the chaos caused by the many battles, Kenneth was able to seize the throne of Dalriada and turned his attention to the Picts. The Picts were also going through a succession crisis of their own. They went through multiple rulers over the course of just 5 years. Kenneth was one of the claimants to the throne. His mother was allegedly a Pictish princess, and as they passed titles through the female line, it should have given him a good claim to the throne. By 848, Kenneth had taken the throne of the Picts, but how exactly this happened is a mystery. Some historians believe it was through simple politics, while others think Kenneth defeated his rivals in a series of wars. A much darker story has been passed on and became a legend. According to the story, the Pictish nobles decided to try to settle the matter through diplomacy. They came together and had a meeting where alcohol was readily available. Kenneth was also invited to the meeting, and in some versions of the story, he was actually the one to host it. His rivals took seats on benches suspended above a pit of spikes. When they were drunk enough, Kenneth had the benches collapse and his rivals met a disturbing end. This story is likely just a story, but it shows that Kenneth was at least seen as a ruthless leader. However it happened, in 848, Kenneth had the throne. A brief summary of his reign was given in the Chronicle of the Kings of Alba. After reuniting the two kings, he moved religious relics away from the coast and into what was previously Pictland, moving the center of power in the kingdom with them. He also conducted raids into his neighboring kingdoms. Even though he would later earn the title of conqueror, he doesn't appear to have done much conquering outside of Dalriada and Pictland. Instead, it's much more likely those raids were simply for money and supplies. We do know that Kenneth's kingdom was attacked by Vikings at least once, but some historians believe he may have thwarted other attacks by actually siding with the Vikings in battles against his neighbors. No matter what the truth of his reign was, Kenneth is today remembered as a unifying force in Scotland, and as the first king of the Scots, even if he never took that title in life. In the spring of 1940, a strange event took place over the skies of Ching-yang in China. It may have cost the lives of tens of thousands of people. It may simply have been an unusual astronomical event. It remains shrouded in mystery and debated by historians and scientists to this day. The Ching-yang event, as it's known, took place in March or April of 1490. The differences in the calendar systems used in China at the time make it difficult to determine in which month exactly the event took place, but we do know that it did take place. The event was recorded in multiple local gazettes and records, and even made it into the history of the Ming, a 332-volume official history of China between 1368 and 1644. Historians see the history of the Ming as a reliable source of information. The fact that the Ching-yang even made it into this chronicle shows that it wasn't just real, but a significant event. According to the chronicles, a rain of stones suddenly began to pour down on the city of Ching-yang. The stones varied in size. Some were as big as goose eggs, but others were as small as water chestnuts. They could weigh as much as 1.5 kilograms, which would have caused significant damage to whatever or whoever they hit. The official story doesn't record any casualties from the event, but local sources say that it was devastating to the city. The records of people who lost their lives range from more than 10,000 to tens of thousands. Other sources simply say that the city was evacuated. There are some important pieces of information missing, which makes it harder to determine what actually happened in Ching-yang. It isn't clear how long this occurred for, or over how great of an area. If the city really was evacuated, this seems to indicate that the event wasn't simply a short shower of rocks. But the story of evacuations could simply be a later exaggeration. Some historians believe that the event may have simply been an extreme hailstorm, which would suggest that it was all over relatively quickly. Others think that the rocks may have come from outer space. The common explanation for the Ching-yang event is that it was some kind of meteor shower. Of course, in most cases, meteorites burn up in the atmosphere during these showers, and nothing actually reaches the Earth. Chinese astronomers were accustomed to meteor showers, so if it was a simple astronomical event, it likely wouldn't have attracted the same level of attention. But another theory is that it was actually a meteor burst, similar to the Tunguska event of 1908. Scientists believe that if the Tunguska event had occurred in a more populated area, it could have cost many lives. As it was, the airburst took place over rural Russia and simply knocked down an estimated 80 million trees. The problem with this theory is that the meteor didn't actually reach the Earth in either of these events, and there are no records of partial debris being discovered. If the Ching-yang event was caused by a meteor burst, the fact that debris rained down to the Earth is very unusual. But no rocks from the event were preserved, and we only have written records to go on. As so many described rocks actually hitting the Earth, it seems likely that this did in fact happen. But without physical evidence, it's impossible to say for certain. It's also impossible to determine whether these were actually rocks from outer space or something more terrestrial in nature. Mabel Crossen was a female aviator who was often spoken about in the same breath as Amelia Earhart. But in the first Women's Air Derby, she crashed in the Arizona brush in mysterious circumstances which were never explained. Mabel and her younger brother Joe became fascinated with flying at a young age. She was born in Indiana in 1900, but the family would later relocate to San Diego. There, Mabel and Joe were able to turn their fascination with planes into careers. They purchased a plane being sold by the Army and put the machine together themselves. Joe would eventually move to Alaska, where the aviation industry was really beginning to take off. Not long after, Mabel would be convinced to follow him. It was while she was in Alaska that she completed her commercial flying tests and received her license, becoming the first woman in the state to get one. There were very few female pilots anywhere in the United States, and Mabel would attract front-page headlines with her achievements. Even something as simple as going back to her birthplace to visit an aunt led to a news report in the local paper. Marvel's many achievements were closely followed, even in an age where female pilots were still generally frowned upon. As well as her commercial flights, Marvel's career included a 2-day flight from Los Angeles to New York, and in 1928, she broke the women's altitude record. It was a difficult achievement as the gasoline in her tank would begin to freeze up when she got too high, but in May of that year, she managed to reach a height of 23,996 feet. The achievement was celebrated across the country, and Marvel appeared in the midweek New York Times pictorial. Also in 1928, she won the North American Aviation's first officially sanctioned women's air race between Palo Alto and Oakland, California. When the first women's derby was planned for August of that year, she was definitely one of the favorites. The first day of the race went without any issues, but on August 19th, Marvel ran into problems. She took off from San Bernardino in California and began to make her way to Phoenix, the second overnight stop. But around noon on August 19th, she crashed near Welton, Arizona. The plane wreckage was quickly found, and Marvel's body was discovered some distance from the wreckage. She had apparently ejected from the aircraft and was wearing a parachute, but it hadn't deployed properly. Some newspapers speculated that she had abandoned the plane too late and hadn't had time to deploy the parachute, while others believed there may have been something wrong with it. Almost immediately, there was speculation about sabotage. Other pilots who had taken part in the Derby complained about their own planes and believed that they'd also been sabotaged. This involved everything from foreign matter clogging up the gas tank to faulty navigational devices. The pilots didn't believe that the culprits were their competitors. Instead, they believed somebody had broken into the airport at night due to the anti-female pilot sentiments. Only one pilot actually backed out of the race due to worries about sabotage. The rest continued on. A very short investigation took place, and the case was dismissed before the race even ended. Some have speculated that rather than sabotage, Marvel may have been suffering from the effects of carbon monoxide. But no tests were run on her remains, and it's impossible to say what happened to her in those final moments. Marvel is mostly forgotten today, but had she lived, she may have rivaled Amelia Earhart as the most well-known female pilot of all time. On the evening of December 1st, 1934, newscasters in the Soviet Union shared the news that party official Sergei Kirov had lost his life after being attacked by an assassin. Even though the person who fired at Kirov was apprehended at the scene of the crime, the circumstances surrounding the attack remain a mystery. Kirov was an important figure within the Soviet Party. He took part in the Civil War on the side of the Bolsheviks and was rewarded with the office of First Secretary of the Communist Party once the fighting had stopped. After the ousting of Grigory Zinoviev, he took over the leadership of the government in Leningrad and set about getting rid of Zinoviev's supporters. He was also described as one of Stalin's closest friends and allies. They would vacation together and talked often on the phone. But there were allegedly some strains on that relationship. Kirov wrote to his wife about being frustrated at the move to Leningrad, which was personally requested by Stalin. He also gave a speech at Stalin's 50th birthday, where he brought up Lenin's testament. This was a document where Lenin allegedly claimed Stalin was unfit to rule. Kirov did follow that by saying he believed Lenin was wrong, but this would have been a controversial speech. Despite these difficulties, Kirov didn't seem to feel any fear for his life when he arrived at work on the afternoon of December 1st. He had originally planned to work from home that day, but had called ahead to say that he would be coming into the office to work on his report after all. He and his bodyguard made their way up to the 3rd floor of the Smolny Institute, the party's headquarters in Leningrad. This area was restricted to only certain party officials, but it was here where Kirov passed Leonid Nikolaev. Nikolaev was waiting outside the office of another party official, but when Kirov passed him, he attacked. A bullet struck Kirov in the neck. Another missed the target. Kirov was taken in the office, but he'd passed away before doctors could arrive. Nikolaev was unconscious when the police arrived and taken for medical care before being arrested. Nikolaev was a former party member who was allegedly a supporter of the ousted Zinoviev. He'd tried to attack Kirov at least once before and was actually known to the Soviet secret police. He'd been arrested for petty crimes and, on one occasion, for carrying a firearm in a restricted area. but on each occasion he'd gotten away with it without any serious punishment. This time, the crime would cost him his life. It also cost the lives of many others. Within days of the attack, the secret police had arrested countless other individuals who were allegedly part of the conspiracy. This was the beginning of the Great Purge, and Stalin took the opportunity to remove many of his political opponents. But some believe that he was actually the person who orchestrated the entire plot. Stalin could have seen Kirov as a threat, as he was relatively popular within the party. Alternatively, he could have simply seen Kirov as the perfect martyr. In 1933, archaeologist Jose Garcia Payon and his team were excavating a site in Tecaxic, Mexico, now known as Calixtlahuaca, when they came across a burial site beneath a pyramid that they found not only interesting but also rather perplexing. They found that the grave site dated between 1476 and 1510, around the same time that Christopher Columbus first set foot in America. They also found the construction of the pyramid to be quite fascinating. It was made up of 3 different levels, and underneath one of those, they discovered a grave offering. They then uncovered several artifacts, including pieces of pottery, shells, gold, pieces of copper rock crystals, jet, and turquoise. But to their surprise, they realized that there was one artifact that didn't seem to belong in the tomb, and to this day no one is quite certain how it got there or why it was placed in the grave in the first place. They were left baffled by their discovery of a strange terracotta head that had been left at the site, and by all accounts it looked like an artifact from the Roman Empire, rather than from Mexico. Garcia Payon had no idea what to make of the find, and so he decided to keep its discovery to himself until he finally published information on it in 1960. He was worried that his peers would accuse him of faking the discovery or playing some elaborate hoax, and when he finally revealed what he had found, speculation ran rife. But despite all of this debating, no one could solve the puzzle of how the head ended up in an area where it never should have been found. For many years, no progress was made in finding out where the head was really from, but in 1995, the head was subjected to thermoluminescence testing in Germany, and it was found to be much older than the grave site where it was found, dating as far back as 184 BC and 616 AD. Then in 2021, 2 researchers, Romeo Ristov and Santiago Genovese, took a look at the artifact since they wanted to finally solve the mystery of its origin, and along with one of the directors of the German Institute of Archaeology, Bernard Andrea, they confirmed that it was ancient and likely dated back to either the 2nd or 3rd century AD, though Andrea speculated it was likely from the 2nd century due to the way that it was carved. Some people suggested that the head was placed there after the original site was disturbed, but no evidence was found to prove this. Ristov and Genovese then speculated that it made its way to Mexico during a transoceanic voyage that was undertaken long before Columbus did so, though they suggest that whoever left the head there wasn't actually looking to discover Mexico and merely happened to land there by accident. Further suggestions included that the head was placed in the grave as a hoax, while Garcia Payon was busy excavating it, but again, this has never been proven. There's also the possibility that it merely looks like an ancient Roman piece of art, but that it was actually created by someone living in the area at the time. This would also explain why it was placed in the grave, since it was unlikely that someone from that era and area would include a Roman artifact in a grave, though this isn't unheard of. One way to solve this mystery once and for all is to discover more Roman artifacts in the same region, but none have ever turned up, and so for now, the mystery of the Tecaxic Calixtlahuaca head remains unsolved. When it comes to out-of-place artifacts, the Coso artifact ranks up there with one of the strangest, as it's baffled researchers since it was first discovered completely by chance in February of 1961. On the 13th of February of that year, 3 men, Wallace Lane, Virginia Maxey, and Mike Mikesell, who owned LM&V Rockhound's Gym and Gift Shop in California, were collecting rocks for their shop in an area about 6 miles from their hometown, in hopes that they would find some geodes. At one stage in the afternoon, they took a break to have some lunch, and they gathered the rocks they'd found together, placing them in a satchel that was being carried by Mikesell. These were then brought back to the shop to be inspected further. The following day, Mikesell was in the process of cutting through one of the rocks with a diamond saw when he realized that he was having trouble cutting through one particular rock, and he nearly broke his saw doing so. At first, he thought the rock contained a geode, but instead he found a perfectly round piece of material that was white in color and incredibly solid. He assumed that it must be porcelain, and when he looked closer, he realized there was even more to the rock than he initially thought. In the center of the porcelain section, he noticed something that looked like a piece of metal that measured about 2 millimeters. He tested it with a magnet and found that it was indeed some kind of metal, but was further confused when he found that the rock contained 2 more pieces of metal that did not react to the magnet. Upon closer inspection, he found that these 2 pieces resembled a screw and a washer, and around the outside of the porcelain section, he found a covering of copper. The outside of the rock was found to contain fossil shells, and when a geologist was asked to give his opinion, he stated that it was at least 500,000 years old. It was then taken for X-ray testing, and the results only brought even more confusion. The upper half of the rock seemed to contain an item that resembled a spring, while the other half contained the copper sheath that covered the porcelain section. No one had any definitive answers, and it was then returned to Wallace Lane, who displayed it at his house but refused to let anyone study it. And there it remained indefinitely. Efforts were made to track the 3 men down in 1999, but these efforts were fruitless since Lane is suspected to have passed away. Mikesell is nowhere to be found, and Maxie, while it's known that he is alive, seems to have chosen to distance himself from the discovery, since he refuses to comment on it publicly. Furthermore, the location of the rock and its contents remain unknown today, and all we have to rely on are the initial inspections that were made. Some people believe that it may be rather modern, no more than 100 years old, while others feel that it could date back as far as 500,000 years ago. As for its purpose, it's been suggested that it was used as some kind of communication tool, a spark plug, a compass, or even a type of antenna. If this is indeed the case, it may suggest that some ancient civilizations were more advanced than we first thought, as unlikely as that may sound. There's always the possibility that it was just a hoax, but since none of the men who discovered the rock can be found, we'll have to look for answers elsewhere. The Dendera Temple of Hathor in Egypt is considered to be one of the best preserved buildings of its kind in the entire country. Construction of the building was started in 54 BC, making it just over 2,000 years old, but despite its age, it's in remarkably good condition. The building contains 3 stone reliefs, one of which contains an image that has sparked a lot of debate among historians and archaeologists, since it depicts something that should not have existed during the time that it was created. The image is known as the Dendera Light, since the image bears a strong resemblance to what we as modern humans know as a light bulb. One end of the image shows what looks like a Crookes tube, while the other end resembles the type of socket one would find on a light bulb. Furthermore, it seems to contain a snake-shaped filament, just as a light bulb would, and underneath the image runs what looks like a cable that many believe would have supplied power to the bulb. Around the bulb, a few human figures can be seen, the most notable being a priest that seems to be holding the bulb aloft. Since its discovery, many people have studied the image in an effort to find out what it's meant to depict, and whether it shows signs that ancient Egyptians had access to technology such as light bulbs. But most historians disagree that this is a light bulb. After studying the images surrounding the bulb, they suggest that it depicts a god as a snake, and that it's rising up out of a lotus flower. He's being carried by the DJ'd pillar, which is represented by the part of the image that looks like a cable. This theory is further supported by our knowledge of Egyptian mythology, which states that a lotus flower was the very thing to emerge from the primordial sea, and it then gave birth to Atum-Ra, the sun god. Furthermore, many other carvings have been found that are known to depict lotus flowers, and those also resemble modern light bulbs. Atum-Ra also has been depicted at other sites as a snake inside of a bubble, which is thought to represent the emergence of the universe out of a void. While most researchers have accepted that the image is meant to represent figures from ancient Egyptian mythology, others aren't as sure, as they still believe the possibility exists that ancient Egyptians had created an electric light bulb or something similar. But there's no way of proving this, since we've never found any text from that time period that mention the use of electricity or devices such as light bulbs. Furthermore, we've never stumbled across any electrical devices while excavating ancient Egyptian sites. But it has been suggested that if this kind of technology did exist, it might have been kept a secret by those in power, as it may have been used during certain secret ceremonies and then destroyed once the ceremony was complete. This would explain why we've never found any of these devices, but for the time being, it would seem that this is likely a piece of art dedicated to Atum-Ra, though this has not been proven beyond doubt. Our history has seen many great poets come and go, but few can boast the recognition that Sappho, a Greek poet that lived on the island of Lesbos between 1610 and 570 BC, received while her work was popular. She was so renowned among her peers that she was given the moniker of the 10th Muse and the Poetess. She was known for her lyric poetry, which was written with the intention that it would be read with musical accompaniment, and was often compared to two other great poets, Archilochus and Alcaeus. It's believed that during her time she wrote about 10,000 lines of poetry, most of which has been lost, and only one complete poem is known to exist. Many of her poems dealt with her personal life and the lives of women in her community, and her work was published in 9 books, none of which survived past the Middle Ages. By the time that the 8th and 9th centuries rolled around, virtually none of her writing was available anymore, except for quotes made in the work of other authors who saw her as an inspiration. The oldest surviving example of her work is printed on papyrus, and it contains 12 lines of a poem called Old Age. The fragments of her work that have been found are usually also written on papyrus, and often need to be studied closely since people in that era were in the habit of using a rather cramped writing style. But now, a new mystery about the poet's work has come to light. Either in 2012 or 2014, depending on which source you trust, a private collector who chose to remain anonymous showed 2 fragments of papyrus to Dirk Obenk from Oxford University, and he immediately realized that these were very important pieces of literary history. One of these poems speaks about Sappho's brothers, and the other has been speculated to be a love poem written about an unknown person. At first, researchers were skeptical about claims that the poems were written by Sappho, but they soon agreed that the writing style, dialect, and meter used were indicative of her work. The fragments were revised by several experts and scholars, all of whom could barely contain their excitement at the discovery of such ancient writing by such a highly regarded poet. But their excitement was short-lived. After the discovery of these fragments came to light, it was found that their provenance was tainted, and they were no longer made available for further study. It was then revealed that the cartonnage that the poems were written on was possibly taken out of Egypt illegally, and when photos of these fragments were published in a Christie's catalog in 2019, and when these were analyzed, experts started expressing their doubts as to whether they were authentic. Since then, that particular piece of cartonnage has been made unavailable for study, and hence its legitimacy cannot be established. Scholars are hopeful that they'll be made available in the future, but until this is done, we don't know whether these fragments were written by Sappho, whether they've been faked, or whether they're writings of another poet from that era. Leonardo da Vinci will forever be regarded as one of history's greatest artists. His most famous works include the Mona Lisa, The Last Supper, The Virgin and Child with St. Anne, and Vitruvian Man. These works are known to have been created by da Vinci and are on display in some of the world's most prestigious museums. But there is one piece of art that he created that's thought to have been lost to time, though some skeptics believe it never actually existed. The piece in question is a mural called The Battle of Anghiari, which is said to have been commissioned by Piero Soderini, who served as an Italian statesman in Florence during the 16th century. The piece, if it exists, is said to depict the victory of the Florentine army over that of the Milanese during a battle that was fought between the two sides in 1440. The only evidence we have that it may have existed comes in the form of sketches and drawings by other renowned artists, such as Peter Paul Rubens. Those who do believe in its existence say that the work was likely abandoned at one point when da Vinci attempted to mix two mediums, oil paint and the fresco technique, with little success. Later on in 1555, the Milanese gained power and commissioned a different artist, Vasari, to create a piece showing the Milanese army defeating the Sienese, and it's been rumored that they had Da Vinci's piece destroyed, though it's also been suggested that it may have been present in Florence. One wall in this building has been found to have an opening behind it that measures mere inches, but it's possible that this lost piece of art may be hidden there. At one point, efforts were made to answer this question by drilling holes in the wall and peering through with an electron microscope. What was found was a black pigment that was known to have been used by Da Vinci, most notably on the Mona Lisa. Traces of a certain lacquer were also found, though it was determined that this type of lacquer would have been used on an actual painting and not a wall. Furthermore, many people have taken a flag that hangs in Florence's town hall to be a clue to this mystery, since it contains text that reads, "Seek and ye shall find." It was then suggested that more holes should be drilled, but since they would have to be drilled through the mural that Vasari painted, many artists protested and signed a petition to stop any further damage being done to it. But we aren't even certain that Da Vinci ever started his commissioned work. Some historians are adamant that he prepared the wall to start the painting, but never got any further before abandoning the project. This is understandable since Vasari's work is also historically significant, but the discovery of a lost Da Vinci artwork would be a monumental one, and hence many artists feel that more research needs to be done, if only to confirm that the piece doesn't exist. Since there is a gap between Vasari's piece and the wall that's rumored to contain Da Vinci's, many historians feel that Vasari intentionally attempted to preserve the mural, since he was fond of Da Vinci and the work he had done up to that point. But this all remains mere speculation, and until further investigation is done, we'll never know whether one of the greatest artists of all time completed this important piece of artwork. When it comes to important pieces of Renaissance art, Michelangelo's name is mentioned more than most others, since he's responsible for creating the Statue of David and for painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. But not many people are aware that the renowned artist found his way to greatness by mere happenstance. At the time, when Michelangelo was about 16 years old, he was working as one of several apprentices to Domenico Ghirlandaio, who was a well-known painter in Florence. While working here, he made a copy of what was then an old sculpture, but he added some of his own details to his sculpture, which he named Mask of a Faun. As luck would have it, Lorenzo de' Medici, Florence's ruler at the time, happened to see the sculpture and was so enamored by it that he decided to pay for Michelangelo to attend his art school, which was called San Marco. The mask was then displayed in a gallery, and it eventually made its way to Bargello National Museum in 1865. There it remained until 1940, when war reached Florence and all of the city's artwork was moved to other areas for safekeeping. But as the war continued to grow and more areas were being affected, the works had to be moved again, and some were then kept at the castle of Poppi in Tuscany. Among those were Michelangelo's mask. However, on the 18th of August, 1944, a German officer was sent to the castle to search it for weapons. He did so and eventually left, but 4 days later, a German captain arrived along with other officers and insisted that each of the castle's rooms be searched again, their excuse being that spies may be hidden inside. The entire building was searched again, but then the captain ordered that a box, which had been numbered 8, be confiscated. Later that same day, soldiers ordered members of the public back into their homes, claiming that they were about to detonate explosives under the town's gates. Many people feel that this was merely a ruse to keep anyone from witnessing the looting that followed. Crates of artwork were stolen while soldiers fired their weapons into the air to fool the townspeople into thinking that a skirmish was underway. By the following morning, the shooting had stopped and the soldiers were gone along with the priceless pieces of art that had been stolen. When it was discovered that it had all been a ruse, German officers claimed that the art was taken to be preserved. A subsequent inspection of the castle revealed that several important pieces of art had been removed, while others were strangely left behind for reasons unknown. Some of the pieces that were missing included artwork by Raphael, Rubens, and Rembrandt. The art was later returned, but 3 important pieces remained unaccounted for. These were a portrait that had been moved to the castle from the gallery and 2 sculptures that had been displayed in the Bargello Museum, one of which was the Mask of a Faun. The sculpture has remained lost ever since, and today the only representation we have of the piece is a cast that's on display at the Bargello Museum. Whether the original mask still exists is anyone's guess, and if it's found one day, it will undoubtedly be priceless. Many other artworks stolen during the war are still found today, and so there is hope that the Mask of a Faun will emerge again one day, but for now its fate remains unknown. General Pancho Villa isn't a name that many of us are familiar with, though he is considered to be an important historical figure. He was an important part of the Mexican Revolution since he successfully led his men through many battles, and later he would be elected as governor of Chihuahua. Before he joined the military, though, he gained a reputation as a bandit who stood against the hacienda system, which ensured that people who were in debt were kept at work on farms and other pieces of land in the country while being paid a pittance. Hence, he was seen as somewhat of a Robin Hood of his time. Thanks to his efforts in the Revolution, he became well known in America, and in January of 1914, it was announced that he would be launching an attack on Mexico's federal forces that were occupying the town of Ojinaga. Furthermore, it was announced that he would be starring in a film that was to be released by the Mutual Film Corporation. They'd agreed to have a camera crew follow Villa around during the attack, and once this was done, the film was named The Life of General Villa. It was first released in New York in May of 1914, and audiences were instantly enthralled at Villa's exploits. It would later come to light that the film wasn't all that it seemed, since Villa was told that he could only engage in battle during the day, since the camera would struggle to capture any footage in the dark. This meant that he had to stop fighting, for the camera at least, at 4 p.m. every day, and in some cases, he had to delay fighting until the camera operator was happy with the angle that he was shooting from. It was also revealed that most of the footage shown to audiences had been recorded in the film studio's lot, since much of the real footage was deemed too unbelievable for American audiences. We know that the film was a success upon its release, but just a few years after it was first seen in America, it mysteriously disappeared. Some people believed that it was the victim of a common practice of the time. In many instances, old reels of film would be repurposed when a new piece of footage was being shot, and it's very possible that the life of General Villa met its end in this manner, though this remains just a theory. Since the film was released before sound was added to moving pictures, its loss is considered a great one, as it would have been regarded as one of the most important silent films ever made. Furthermore, it would have been considered an important piece of historical documentation, despite much of the footage being added after the fact. But there is, of course, the possibility that the film still exists somewhere, possibly tucked away in someone's attic, and that it will be found again one day. But this is a very unlikely scenario, since it's far more likely that it was unintentionally destroyed. Villa would eventually lose his life after he retired, spending most of his time at his hacienda in Canutillo. On the 20th of July, 1923, he was driving around the town of Parral in Chihuahua when he was targeted by an assassin. The film remains missing today, and chances are that it'll never be found again. Myanmar, previously known as Burma, is the location of a mystery that has frustrated historians for centuries. The country once boasted ownership of the world's biggest bell ever cast, the Great Bell of Damazetti, but today its location remains unknown. The bell is said to have been cast of gold, silver, and copper, and weighed as much as 300 tons. After it was completed, it was placed next to the Golden Shwedagon Temple, and must have been seen as an extremely important piece, since this temple is regarded as the most sacred in the entire country. The bell was seen by many travelers, including Gasparo Balbi, who visited the region in 1583, and the Portuguese adventurer and mercenary Felipe de Brito. Quite remarkably, de Brito decided in 1608 that he needed the bell for his own purposes, and so proceeded to remove it from the temple. He had it rolled down a hill and placed it on a raft in a creek. He then used several elephants to move it to a nearby Pego River, which is known as the Bago River today, after which the raft was fastened to his ship with the aim of moving it to an area where it could be melted down. His intention was to use the metal to construct cannons for the same ship, but his plan didn't work as he intended. Just a short while into the journey, they reached a point where the Bago and Yangon rivers meet, and here the raft holding the bell was torn apart by the flowing water, and the bell sank to the bottom. This has led to much speculation since the bell has never been found, and it would make a remarkable discovery, but no records exist that it was ever recovered, or that any efforts were made back then to look for it. It's said that for a very long time, one could see the top of the bell sticking out of the water when the tides were low enough. Some people have stated that they on occasion have rowed out to the site to look at what could be seen of the bell, and they report that it was under at least 20 feet of water. It's possible that the river caused the riverbed beneath the bell to erode over time, causing it to sink further down and out of sight. Since then, archaeologists and treasure hunters have been searching for the bell, but none have had any success. Over the past 3 decades, at least 7 attempts have been made to locate it. Some of these search efforts were made by groups of people who had modern technology at their disposal, but its exact location remains a mystery. But it isn't just historians who are eager to find the bell, since it's an important part of Myanmar's history. Many people have donated money towards search efforts, and many of those can be seen on the riverbanks as the searches continue. These operations are made all the more hazardous by the fast-moving currents in the river, and many of the local people believe the bell remains hidden thanks to spirits that are preventing it from being located. This is also one of the reasons why modern technology isn't used by local searchers. Many people believe that if machines were used, it might anger the dragon spirit, who may then decide to keep the bell for itself. Furthermore, it's been suggested that the river doesn't follow the same route that it did when the bell was lost, and hence it's very possible that these searches are being conducted in the wrong area. There are also those who are skeptical of the legend, as they feel the bell never really existed and that the entire tale is just made-up fiction. This theory is strengthened by the fact that the bell was never mentioned in history books for 2 centuries after it was said to have been lost. But this has done little to dampen the spirits of those who believe in its existence, and the frantic searches for this bell will likely continue for a long time to come. The year 1906 saw the release of the very first ever feature-length film. One would imagine that such an honor would go to a film shot in the USA, but the fact is that the story of the Kelly Gang is a silent movie filmed in Melbourne, Australia, which is where it also premiered on Boxing Day of that year. While we're used to seeing movies that run for between 2 and 3 hours in modern times, the story of the Kelly Gang ran for just over an hour, a length of film that was unheard of at the time. The film was directed by Charles Tate and follows the escapades of Ned Kelly and his gang of bushranger outlaws. It centers on the efforts by the authorities to bring the gang to justice, as well as the crimes committed by the gang while they were being sought. In the end, Kelly is the last surviving member of the group, but he's eventually wounded during a standoff with the police and ends up begging for his life to be spared. Thus, the gang had been eradicated and justice won the day. At the time, no one could have foreseen how important the film would be to the history of movie making, and hence it wasn't preserved at all. Prints of the movie were shown in England in 1908, but these no longer exist. And by the time the Second World War was fought and won, the last remaining copy was nowhere to be found. It was then that the film's importance was realized, but it wouldn't be until 1976 that a few remaining remnants were discovered. They lay undiscovered in a collection of film that was owned by Vic Reeve, an Australian collector who later realized that he owned 11 frames of the lost film. 2 years later, more fragments were found in the most unlikely of ways. 2 contractors named Peter Weinstock and James Swan had been employed to clean the house of a known film collector named Ernest Goldhawk. It's here that Weinstock decided to keep a tin that was labeled nitrate film, and soon after that, he took the film that he found inside to a man named Ken Robb, who was amazed at what his friend had uncovered. 2 years after that, more fragments were found in someone's trash, and were taken to the National Film and Sound Archive of Australia. The person who found these fragments remains unknown since they didn't want to be named. Then, in 2006, more fragments resurfaced at the UK's National Film and Television Archive, and the pieces of the film are now considered to be the longest surviving continuous footage that has ever been recovered. That same year, efforts were undertaken to restore as much of the original film as possible and to place each of the fragments in the order that they were filmed. The footage was then preserved digitally, allowing it to be cleaned up even further and for the footage to be stabilized. Some sources state that as many as 17 minutes of the film have been saved and restored, but much of it still remains missing. No one is certain whether more fragments survived through the decades, and only time will tell if historians will be able to add more footage to this historically important film. General Tomoyuki Yamashita is remembered for his military service during the Second World War. He was in charge of Imperial Japanese soldiers, whom he led to victory in battles across southeastern Asia, eventually liberating Malaya from British occupation. This feat was made all the more impressive by the fact that he completed it within just 70 days, earning him the moniker the Tiger of Malaya. However, while these battles raged on, Japanese soldiers looted the area and made off with about 6,000 tons of gold that was destined to be used as finance in aid of Japanese forces. At one stage, Yamashita and his men were defending Manila, the capital of the Philippines, but he soon realized that it was a lost cause, and he ordered his men to retreat to safety. They decided to move into the Sierra Madre Mountains, but it soon became apparent that he and his men were still in possession of the stolen loot. Locals started to speculate that he couldn't possibly carry all that treasure, and so they believed he hidden much of it in the mountains, specifically in a network called the Golden Lily Tunnels. These tunnels were specifically dug into the mountain with the purpose of hiding the treasure, and it said that many of the soldiers and locals who helped carry the treasure inside were sealed up with gold. This was done so that no one but Yamashita could locate it after the fact, the only exception being Prince Takeda, who was a member of the Imperial House of Japan. But Yamashita took the location of the gold to the grave with him, after he was found guilty of committing war crimes and was executed by the United States Army in 1946. The trove is said to include religious artifacts, artwork that was stolen from various museums, cash, and even property that was looted from houses belonging to members of the public. One man who claims to have seen the inside of one of the tunnels has reported that the chamber contained several crates containing not only large amounts of gold, but also a 20-carat statue of Buddha that measures about 3 feet in height. It's believed that part of the treasure stash was recovered at one point, and it's said to have contained gold and other items that were valued at over $22 billion. Others believe that the gold was actually moved to Singapore, after which it was taken to the Philippines with the aim of moving it to Japan once the war was over. Those who subscribe to this theory further believe that many of the ships carrying the treasure met their end before reaching their destinations. And if this is indeed the case, it's very unlikely that those parts of the loot will ever be recovered. There's also a theory that Yamashita was forced to reveal the treasure's location to Marcos, the former president of the Philippines, who then pilfered the caves. But this has never been proven, and for all we know, the treasure may still be buried in the Sierra Madre Mountains. Describing our ancestors as being a primitive society is often a misnomer. It depicts them as barbaric, an erroneous description. They built the most complex megaliths and left behind a world of mystery that our greatest historians and archaeologists have yet to discover. Such remnants can be found in the enigmatic geoglyphs that we find littered across the landscape. Before embarking on this mystery, we have to understand exactly what a geoglyph is. They're handmade drawings that have been carved into the land by removing the upper layers of soil. They often exceed lengths of 4 meters. There exist 2 different kinds, one of which refers to a positive geoglyph that makes use of rocks and other durable objects. We also have negative geoglyphs, which are created by the removal of soil. Some of these pictograms have been found in the Amazon forest, but the most famous remains the Nazca lines. However, the cultural significance of these drawings has remained a mystery for ages. Drawings range from cat-like figures to spiral-tailed monkeys, all of which can only be realized once in the air. As time goes on, more and more ancient geoglyphs are being discovered. A set of twisting lines have been recently discovered in the Thar Desert of India, a geoglyph believed to be the largest one ever discovered. This glyph consists of many spirals, as well as a snaking line that doubles back on itself over and over. The pattern covers over 51 acres of land, situated near the Pakistan border. Hiking along the spirals would make for a 30-mile venture. It isn't certain as to how this particular glyph was created, but it is located near many rock cairns and memorial stones, the latter of which have been adorned with images of Krishna and Ganesha. Many of these patterns are believed to have been made using a plow pulled by a draft animal, most likely a camel. These spirals were discovered on Google Earth back in 2014 during a virtual survey. Since it was found near the village of Boha, the lines were subsequently named the Boha Lines, or the Boha Geoglyph. These lines, despite being the largest discovery, are said to be subtle on the ground. They were dug into the desert sand 4 inches deep, and are only around 80 to 20 inches wide. Based on the weathering and vegetation in and around the lines, the designs are estimated to be anywhere between 150 and 200 years old. The entirety of this glyph, though, is made up of many different spirals, the largest of which covers 0.05 square miles. Another spiral trails off into faint lines, which means that this geoglyph was a lot bigger. Additionally, 9 stone structures were discovered in and around the lines. 1 was a 5-foot-tall pillar, 3 were rock cairns, 4 were memorial stones bearing inscriptions, and the final stone was a stone which memorializes a widow. But there are plenty of memorial stones all around the desert, so they may not have had anything to do with the lines themselves. Despite all the research that goes into these discoveries, they remain misunderstood. The best guess is that the designs are some form of ceremonial function. The Boha lines have been separated into 2 parts. One is called Boha 1, and the other is Boha 2. The first is what's thought to be the largest ever discovered, while the second one is a multi-patterned drawing. Each of these is made up of enigmatic symbolism that's unique from the rest of the world. Researchers also believe that they were made using planimetric knowledge, such as the elements used in roads, rivers, and lakes. These lines in India serve as an enduring mystery, leaving archaeologists scratching their heads as to how they were made, and more importantly, why. Number 9. A London furniture conservator may have made a discovery that can ultimately change history as we know it. Ben Bacon analyzed some 20,000-year-old markings that could help us understand why Ice Age hunter-gatherers drew in caves. This crucial archaeological breakthrough may push the timeline of written language back tens of thousands of years. Our independent researcher has come to suggest that the earliest human writing has been right in front of our eyes this whole time, in already discovered cave paintings in Europe. Various European caves that were once occupied by ancient civilizations have been adorned with fascinating drawings of animals and other figures. These depictions were created anywhere between 15,000 and 40,000 years ago, amidst the Paleolithic Age, during a period when humans were still hunter-gatherers. Often, these depictions include non-figurative markings like dots and lines, which have evaded explanation for ages. Mr. Bacon, though, who describes himself as nothing more than a person on the street, noticed something strange while he was admiring some pictures of cave paintings from Europe. It didn't take long for him to develop a hunch that these dots and lines were decipherable after all. The dots and lines that accompany animals and figures may be the very first example of the lunar calendar, according to the London Man. He detailed that while looking at the pictures, he noticed that the animals each had a number associated with them, which was thought to convey information on how many of that animal had been sighted, or how many had been successfully hunted. But Bacon believes that they're a calendar system that keeps track of animals' life cycles. The amateur researcher ended up enlisting some leading archaeologists from Durham University and the University of London to develop the idea. It's widely accepted that the dots and lines depict number-based information, but we may have been wrong about what information it had been. It makes more sense, according to these archaeologists, that the numbers are predicting migratory movements in periods of aggregation, like mating and birthing. Supporting this idea is that each painting never exceeds 13 symbols, which means that they may denote lunar months. Adding to this is the accompanying Y symbol, believed to be the representation of birth. The researchers also say that this lunar calendar wouldn't track time across the years, but rather it would be rebooted every year, either in late winter or early spring. The advantage of this calendar was that it was stable in describing the life cycles of both animals and plants, even though there were great geographical and cultural differences in the area. In order to test the theory, the team embarked on establishing a database consisting of more than 600 line and dot sequences without the Y symbol. They also compiled a database with 250 Y sequences, which appear mostly in Spain and France. They found that the sequences span over thousands of years, accompanying depictions of birds, bison, deer, horses, mammoth, fish, and an extinct species of rhino that once roamed Europe. Bacon and his colleagues were shocked to find that the lunar calendar was consistent with the patterns of aggregation periods. The team concluded that their data found that the purpose of the system was really associating animals with the calendar to record and convey the seasonal behavior of their ancient civilization's preferred prey. The work was surreal for Baker and his team, discovering something that would ultimately change all we know of our ancestors and the real reasoning behind many cave paintings. Everything that we thought we knew about the past may not be true, and all must now be reevaluated. Number 8. Dotting the Scottish Highlands are a series of ancient stone structures, mysterious circular symbols known as brochs, but their true purpose continues to baffle experts. Through Scotland's deep glens, its mist, and moorland, one may come across these crumbling towers that peek through the highlands like cragtop castles. These Iron Age monuments are found to be unique to this area. They exist nowhere else. Despite not knowing their purpose, these dry-walled structures remain a symbolic feature. There are only some facts known about the brochs, such as that they were built around 2,000 years ago. Local tribes began to collect stone to build these prehistoric structures, with walls that measured a thickness of 5 meters, stretching to around 13 meters in height. There have been 100 to 500 broch sites discovered and identified, with the densest concentration being in the northern counties and the Northern Isles, where stones are more readily available than timber. Most of the sites, though, have been left crumbling in ruins. Initially, archaeologists believed that these creations were citadels of local chieftains. But many more recent discoveries have come to suggest that these stone towers were used for residential purposes. In an effort to learn more about the towers, an initiative known as the Caithness Broch Project is underway. It aims to reconstruct one of these sites fully, while incorporating the same masonry techniques used by the inhabitants of the Iron Age. Researchers have found that the most complete examples of brochs resemble cooling towers and modern power stations. Some believe that the towers may have various purposes depending on time and place. These fortified houses had one small and easily defended entrance that led to an inner courtyard. Each building is made up of 2 concentric walls, which produce a hollow-walled tower. There are small rooms within and storage areas between them. Steps would also be built in the gap to allow access to the upper compartments. The brochs may not have been the standard living quarters for the inhabitants, but many may have taken refuge within them when or if a raiding party was sighted. As mentioned though, the recent studies revealed that they would have been far too weak to withstand an attack, and they could have easily been scaled, since the stones gave attackers enough footing to climb the walls. These weren't defensive towers either. Those inside wouldn't have been able to see out given the lack of windows. They were denied the advantage of visibility as well as height, making the brochs useless for this reason. Archaeologists have also discovered that brochs were meant to impress, which is why they've also been attributed to tribal chiefs. For an unknown reason, around 100 AD, the fashion of brochs began to decline. According to recent evidence, the existing stone towers continued to be occupied well into the Scottish Late Iron Age. The finest example of these creations is the Broch of Mosa, which can be found in the Shetlands. It rises to 13.3 meters in length, which makes it the tallest prehistoric building in Britain. Despite so many of the hollowed shells of the brochs that litter the expanse of the Scottish territory, they remain an enduring mystery. Hopefully, through the Caithness Broch Project, we will be able to understand their function more. Number 7. There's an ongoing debate relating to the last pharaoh of the 6th dynasty, which regards their existence. Adding to this is the gender of this last pharaoh. Some sources claim that it was a female pharaoh, which was incredibly rare before the Ptolemaic dynasty area. Usually when female pharaohs were in a position to rule, it was because their sons were not of age. The most famous of the early female rulers is Hatshepsut from the 18th dynasty, who ruled with her stepson and nephew, Thutmose III. But that was all the way in the 18th dynasty, where this woman ruled as early as the 6th dynasty. This pharaoh is commonly referred to by her Greek name, Nitocris, who, unlike Hatshepsut, is far more mysterious. Aside from the fact that she'd been mentioned by Herodotus and Manetho, very little evidence points to her true existence. She's guessed to have been inhabiting the area around the 22nd century BC. Archaeologists discovered a fragment of the Turin King list, called Turin Papyrus, or the Turin Royal Canon. On this list, there's a name belonging to an unknown pharaoh, Neti-Kurti, the successor of Mnemosyth II. Some suggest that the unidentified Neti-Kurti is in fact Nitocris. The Turin King list is believed to have been written during the early reign of Ramses II, while the Abydos King list was discovered on the wall in a temple of Set I. Neither of these sources explicitly name Nitocris. There appears to be nothing more than the written record by Manetho regarding this individual, as well as that of Greek historian Herodotus. It's for this elusiveness in records that not much is known about the last leader of the 6th dynasty. A short timeline of events regarding the pharaoh has been established though, whether she's real or not. Nitocris gained her position through her brother, who met his demise while he was the king of Egypt. The same people who attacked him, according to this assumed timeline, also put this mysterious pharaoh in power. Apparently, she also established an underground chamber that she used for nefarious acts, like unleashing the Nile River into the room while her guests were inside. Many believe that she was the first queen regnant of Egypt. Nitocris may have reigned at the end of the Egyptian Old Kingdom, more than 4,000 years ago. As for Manetho, the high priest who lived in the Delta during the 3rd century BC, he speaks of Nitocris as being the bravest and most beautiful woman of her time. He also credited her with building the 3rd pyramid of Saqqara. According to the priest, she reigned for around 12 years. According to a prominent Egyptologist, Percy Newberry, her name means Neith is excellent, and points out that the 3rd pyramid is a monument to Neith, the ancient Egyptian goddess. Strangely, the name Neith also appears on the tomb of one of the wives of King Pepi II, who ruled toward the end of the 6th dynasty. So the mystery of the existence of this ruler remains a topic of debate among historians and Egyptologists. With so much conflicting evidence and contrasting sources, it's difficult to determine if the ruler during the 6th dynasty was in fact a woman, or if she even existed at all. Number 6. John Singleton Mosby was born in 1833 in Edgemont, where he grew up and became a Confederate Ranger. His guerrilla band often attacked the Union supply lines in Virginia and Maryland amidst the American Civil War. In 1855, he was admitted to the bar and practiced law up until the Civil War of 1861. One of the events that this individual is best remembered for is the attacks he launched with just 9 men, but he's best known for a hidden treasure that is yet to be found. Mosby's tale begins at a time when he became known as the Gray Ghost, a name given to him due to his quick raids and the ability to elude the Union Army. As he made his way up the ranks, Mosby became part of a small cavalry unit that was sent to central Virginia. The unit immediately began to torment Union positions. Together, they would slip through the cover of the darkness into Union territory, capture the soldiers, and gather supplies. They were a true guerrilla force. On the 9th of March in 1863, the Gray Ghost embarked on a raid inside Union lines, close to the Fairfax County Courthouse. It was around 2 in the morning, and through the rain, he and his 29 men appeared in the town. They were able to slip past the troops and through the camps and cut telegraph lines as they moved. The Rangers captured a few guards while Mosby headed for the General Edwin Stoughton's bedroom. After taking the general prisoner, he helped himself to $350,000 worth of silver, gold, jewelry, and family heirlooms, all of which had been taken by the Union troops from Southern houses. The entire ordeal took 1.5 hours, after which they galloped out of town with prisoners, horses, and treasure. But while they were heading back, one of the scouts warned Mosby that there were Union troops nearby. In case of a confrontation, he and a fellow sergeant left the trail and buried the sack of treasures between 2 pine trees. The Gray Ghost marked the area with an X using his sharpened blade and managed to make it back into Confederate territory. 2 days after this, Mosby was promoted to captain. According to the legend, he later sent his sergeant and 6 other men to retrieve the cache, but when they reached the spot, they were captured by the Union troops. no one knows if Mosby ever returned to grab his treasure. According to one account, he said while on his hospital bed that valuable treasures awaited in the Virginia countryside. The valuables are yet to be found, and with no map, they may never be uncovered. According to some, the sack was buried between Norman and Culpeper near Route 522. Prior to his passing, Mosby said the following to his friends, saying, quote, "I've always meant to look for the cachet we buried. I guess that one of these days someone will find it." But no one ever did. The accounts of the treasure, though, vary in detail. Some sources claim that it lies beneath the ground, anywhere between Route 29 and Route 211, and this is a whole lot of dirt to try to dig up. Number 5. Ophir refers to an unidentified but often mentioned place in the Old Testament. It's known for its fine gold and is associated with King Solomon. The region has captivated many throughout history since its mention. It was referred to in a book by Henry Rider Haggard titled King Solomon's Mines. There was also a movie in 1950 with a similar name. Ophir has become the central point of ancient explorers and their quests. The lost mine of Ophir refers to an area, according to the Bible, where King Solomon's wealth had been stored, amounting to somewhere around 2.3 million pounds. According to many historians, the riches and mines are believed to be a myth, but there's much evidence to prove their existence. During a 1946 archaeological excavation, an ostrakhan was discovered. An ostrakhan is the name given to a pottery shard that contains an inscription. The excavation had taken place in Tel Aviv. This pottery shard testifies to the importance of this particular settlement during the 8th century BC, when it was recognized as the center of imports and exports. Other ostraka have been discovered here as well, one of which describes 1,100 measures of oil for the king. Another shard's inscription was translated and read Ophir gold to Bet Horon, 30 shekels. An Israeli archaeologist, Professor Benjamin Mazar, explained in a journal that Bet Horon may have been referring to a twin city, Upper and Lower Beth Horon, also known as Levitz. Levitz is within the district of Ephraim and is said to have been a store city during Solomon's era. The archaeologist also believes that the name may refer to a temple of the Canaanite god Haran, but whichever it is, the shard confirms the existence of Ophir in the ancient world. Mazar claims that the gold of Ophir is of fine quality, which is also how it's described in biblical texts. It's mentioned at least 3 times throughout different books. Of course, mentions of these ancient places haven't gone without purported and unconfirmed discoveries, such as the Portuguese explorer of the 15th century, who claimed that the lost mine was in the Shona lands of Zimbabwe. Christopher Columbus thought that he discovered the grounds in Haiti. Sir Walter Raleigh found what he thought to be the mine in a jungle of Suriname. In 1568, a Spanish captain came across an archipelago, which he believed was the lost mine, and subsequently named it the Solomon Islands. The geographical listing for the unidentified area is believed to be somewhere in Arabia. Many areas of the Arabian Peninsula have been proposed as sites that are likely to be sites of Ophir. Other alternatives, though, point to India and East Africa. Egyptian pharaohs sent a naval expedition to hunt for monkeys, frankincense, and ivory, which lends credence to the idea of the place being in East Africa. But a historian named Josephus, as well as Saint Jerome, believed that the site was originally built in India. The Hebrew words for the products of the ancient area are believed to have been derived from India and the languages spoken there at the time. Sandalwood and peacocks were common in India, but not in East Africa. These conflicting aspects leave the true location of the lost mine of Ophir an intriguing mystery that will continue to be the center of adventure and exploration for those eager to discover it. Number 4. The Chaco Canyon is considered to be one of the best places in the United States to view the stars. It can be found in the Four Corners area of New Mexico. This shallow canyon was once home to an ancient Native American society. Remnants of the civilization indicated a sophisticated infrastructure, which aligned with celestial bodies. The inhabitants occupied the area for 400 years and were said to be a highly sophisticated tribe. The area boasted incredible buildings that were made from stone, each of which could house around 700 rooms in underground halls called kivas. Chaco Canyon is home to many mysteries. One such mystery concerns the rationale of the establishment in the first place. It resides in one of the harshest areas on Earth, with 100+ degree summers and very frigid winters. There's limited rainfall here, making living conditions quite trying. Then there's the mystery of why the society decided to set up base here. Some believe that due to their aptitude for astronomy, the Chacoan people resided here for the purpose of reading the stars. The Anasazi people resided in the canyon between 850 and 1250. No one is certain as to why, but at some point the society disappeared from the cave homes. This remains an enduring mystery, and it plays a role in this puzzle. The puzzle is that NASA, the government agency focused on space exploration, has for the last 40 years been investigating Chaco Canyon, and we'd like to know why. It could be that they're merely interested in the canyon for the same reasons that the Anasazi were. It's just a great place to see the stars. But some believe that our ancestors were more advanced than we think, and this is why NASA has exhibited an interest in the area. Some think that the government's interest in Chaco Canyon may have something to do with space travel. NASA's research began in the 1970s after they discovered 300 kilometers of roadways and kivas through scanning technology. What's strange about the roadways is that they were overbuilt and constructed without a destination. It's likely, though, that they were constructed for symbolic or cosmographical purposes. It's noted that society developed this form of architecture using advanced geometry, labor, and keen attention to detail. While NASA attributed the study of the canyon to celestial linearity and gaining a better understanding of the sun, some experts think that they're targeting something bigger. Positing the idea that this ancient society had a role in space travel, some argue that this civilization was more scientifically and technologically advanced than we give them credit for. They were so advanced that they could have made their way to space, and that's why NASA is so interested in possibly even learning from their methodologies. Not only is Chaco Canyon's architecture an extraordinary example of engineering capabilities, but they also constructed it in accordance with solar cycles and celestial bodies, which indicated a deeper understanding that the society may have had for space. The inhabitants of the canyon disappeared mysteriously. They left no trace. Archaeologists found no burial grounds here despite the many years of occupancy. And now, due to NASA's involvement, some believe that their disappearance may have had something to do with their fascination for the stars in space. This is also where the Kali Yuga predictions come in. It's been posited that the Chacoan race used their high intelligence and other advancements to escape an upcoming cataclysmic event. According to ancient Sanskrit writing, the Earth goes through 4 yugas, or epochs. The fourth and final age was called Kali Yuga, which translates to Age of the Demon. This is believed to be the final era before some sort of colossal catastrophe takes place. The Chaco Canyon people discovered that this event would be coming and departed the planet, which is perhaps why NASA has become interested in the area. The government space agency has partnered up with many other organizations, launching a space archaeology campaign in the greater Chaco region. The researchers are making use of thermal imagery and other forms of investigation, but the question remains, why? Number 3. In the city of Aswan, along the Nile, is an Egyptian temple known as Kom-Ombo. It was built around 180 BC and was dedicated to 2 Egyptian gods, Horus and Sobek. When the temple was established, Egypt was under the control of the Ptolemaic dynasty. The Ptolemy family was conquered in 30 BC. We then have a carved head of Marcus Aurelius, who ruled from 161 to 180 as a Roman emperor. The bust shows his curly hair and meandering beard. Aurelius's passing is believed to have sparked the beginning of the end of the Western Roman Empire. But what is the correlation between this ancient temple and the Roman statue? Well, the bust was discovered near the Kom-Ombo temple while archaeologists were pulling groundwater from a 50-foot well to reduce the level. It was dated back to around 160 to 182 AD. Discoveries such as these are listed as out-of-place artifacts. Finding Roman artifacts in Egypt is extremely rare, despite the fact that the Ptolemy family was succeeded by the Romans, who then took Egypt under their rule. Even though the area was under Roman rule, finding a bust of this Roman emperor, one of the 5 good emperors, is very unlikely. Similar discoveries have been made in the area in more desperate regions. During this time, the archaeologists also discovered another statue that is yet to be identified. Other out-of-place artifacts have been discovered in Egypt, such as a shrine dedicated to Osiris and a temple placed in Luxor. Osiris shrines are common in the northern and eastern regions, but finding one in a southern location is very rare. Ancient Egyptians traveled the world, and they may have come to accumulate a variety of objects relating to other cultures. But just how the Roman statues and the bust of an emperor came to be in the vicinity and in a 50-foot well will forever be a mystery. Number 2. Deep within the arid lands of Syria lies a unique archaeological site. Ain Dara is a small village located northwest of Aleppo. Up until 2018, the site boasted an Iron Age Syro-Hittite temple. Some of this ancient village, though, was reduced to rubble following a Turkish airstrike. Ain Dara consists of other complexes, all of which center around the incredible temple. The temple was complete with a grand courtyard, basalt reliefs, and some strange-looking footprints on the stone floor. The giant footprints had been hand-carved into the limestone blocks, referred to as the giant footsteps of the gods. A set of 2 can be found on the floor of the portico, followed by a singular print, and then another singular print, as though a giant being had stood there before taking 2 steps forward. The distance between the 2 single feet is 30 feet, a stride that one would expect from a being measured at least 65 feet tall. Of course, it isn't suggested that these prints are of a real person or being, but rather were carved by the creators. The mystery here, though, is why. It's still debated as to whose prints these were intended to be, or what they represent. Some scholars believe that it may be animal prints or the footsteps of the gods. These 3.28-foot-long feet could have been the representation of a resident deity. They walk in the direction of the temple, as though a resident deity were to approach their throne in the inner sanctum. Adding to the intrigue was the structure of the Ain Dara temple itself. It was an immense building, one that would comfortably allow a 65-foot-tall being to enter, according to researchers. It's widely accepted that the idea behind the prints may have been the representation of a deity, but other theories about their presence abound. Some researchers, along with historians, posit that the footsteps actually belonged to a giant humanoid believed to be our forefathers. Others think that they were the markings of a clawed creature. Of course, the most accepted idea is that the worshippers carved the prints themselves using tools and equipment. Furthering the mystery, some historians have pointed to the fact that the Ain Dara temple holds some similarities to the Temple of Solomon. But whatever this coincidence means and the origins of the mysterious footprints, the site remains a powerful reminder of the worshippers of the times when the gods or deities walked among the people. Unfortunately, though, the reason behind the carvings, whether or not they belong to gods or giants, will forever remain a mystery. This is because the temple sustained heavy damage, leaving only ruins. The looting of the basalt lions completed the destruction, and only rubble remains. Number 1. This is the story of a mysterious missing treasure that many believe was hidden away by a man named Erwin Rommel. Rommel was a German field marshal during the Second World War. He rose in fame, becoming one of the most popular generals, and accumulated many victories during his rule as commander of the Afrika Korps. During the carnage, chaos, and pillaging of the war, numerous pieces of fine art, valuable artifacts, and unique treasures were lost. Museums all over the country had been looted. Ever since the end of the atrocities, there have been many rumors of missing and hidden treasures that the troops had sold off. Tales abound about the Amber Room and Raphael's portrait of a young man. But this mystery concerns Erwin Rommel's treasure. During the war, the northern countries of Africa were under German occupation, where victims from Tunisia and Libya were forced to undergo immense persecution, which left many of their properties looted by Germans. The valuables among this loot had been sealed up in 6 metal boxes bound for Germany. Somewhere along the course begins the mystery of Rommel's gold. During their occupancy in Tunisia, Rommel's unit allegedly gathered gold and other items that were worth tens of millions of dollars. The marshal ended up accumulating 20 million pounds worth of gold. The gold and the valuables taken from the inhabitants have never been recovered. Strangely though, the Desert Fox, as he would become known, wasn't directly involved in this specific theft. If the treasure has never been found, then how do we know if it even exists? Well, one man, a 21-year-old Czech named Peter Flagg, brought the idea of the treasure to the public's attention. He was an engineer and diver under Rommel's command. He'd been reassigned to an Italian port where he was tasked with keeping the area free of sea mines and salvaging vessels that were damaged. In September of 1942, he was given orders through Captain Ludwig Dahl to travel via a motorboat with a full set of diving gear to the island of Corsica. Peter was instructed to keep this order a secret, and after completing his mission, he was instructed to destroy the diving gear and any written evidence of the event. And so he arrived in Bastia, Corsica in the dark of night. He and Captain Dahl headed to an abandoned German barracks. They met 3 lieutenants there. They'd been tasked with transporting 6 ominous metal crates off the island. The stolen treasures were heading for the heart of Germany. The plan was that the crates would be moved through Italy by truck, but due to the Allied air power and the ambushes, this plan was deemed too risky. And so they received orders for the package to be taken through a sea route, during which the men would join a convoy that was headed for La Spezia. But upon their arrival, the convoy had already left. According to Peter, the group then decided to hide Rommel's riches away. The crates were dropped into the ocean off the coast. It was due to be retrieved after the war, but as we know, this never happened. Coordinates were later discovered on the back of a family photo that belonged to an SS officer who was jailed in Dachau. These coordinates are believed to mark the spot, half a mile from the beach near Bastia, where the treasure may have been dumped. But investigators, though, suggest that since they've been submerged for so long, the crates may have disintegrated by now, leaving the cargo hidden beneath the seabed. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.